Good morning, everybody here in this room and watching around the world or around the block. My name is Peter Miller and I'm the Dean. And on behalf of the director, Susan Weber, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here to this symposium devoted not just to Majolica mania, but to its French connection. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the intellectual and cultural life of the Bard Graduate Center here on West 86th Street in Manhattan on the island once of Manhattan is unfolding on the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people. Now, just for a moment, I'd like to say, to orient you to the way in which this show represents the Bard Graduate Center. First of all, it starts with a commitment to the public, to bring to the public a forgotten or ignored piece of the history of decorative arts or design or material culture. It is deeply researched and its questions are broadly cast. And finally, it is presented to the public, both in a book and in a gallery space, designed and installed and laid out to the highest possible standards, both of accessibility and beauty. This is the director's vision, and the director is the curator of this exhibition. Before I introduce her to start the symposium, just a few words of introduction. Her master's is from the Cooper Hewitt program, her PhD from the Royal College of Art. Her main contribution, in addition to founding the Bard Graduate Center, I think posterity would say, has been the series of exhibitions that she has devoted to the British tradition of decorative arts and design, starting with E.W. Godwin, followed by exhibitions and publications devoted to Thomas Jekyll, James Athenian Stewart, Thomas Hope, and William Kent. But in recent years, she has also moved into the realm of craft and folk, curating an exhibition on Swedish wooden toys, into material culture with an extraordinary project on the American circus, and to the transnational history of design, John Lockwood Kipling, Arts and Crafts in the Punjab and London. Majolica may stand between these two commitments, on the one hand to filling in the blank spots on the map of the history of decorative arts, and also seeing the arts as part of the web of productive relations of a given society at a given place at a given time. Finally, just a quick word about how today's event will run. There is a small audience from the BGC here in the lecture hall. For those of you watching at home, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and your question will be read out. We have automatic captioning, which you can turn on using the CC option at the bottom of your screen. We are also recording this event, and a copy of the video will be available on our website and YouTube channel. And now it is a great pleasure and honor to introduce the curator of the exhibition and the founder and director of the Bard Graduate Center, Susan Weber.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Peter, for that very kind introduction. Now, the Majolica mania journey has taken us, I would say, 6 or 7 years. And the journey started with casting our net extremely wide. And what we began to realize was that there were thousands and thousands of makers, and they were in every country imaginable. And we decided then that the topic was so large that we would have to decide on which facet of the subject to deal with. And learning more about the history of Majolica, we discovered that it was claimed to be a British invention, but that for an American audience, it would be really important to discover how that invention crossed the Atlantic and came to America and was so important in the development of ceramic manufacture in the United States. Now, the importance of French influence is a facet of British and American Majolica scholarship that has largely been left out of the narrative. And we hope that today's symposium is a step to correct the balance and recognize the importance of French designers and chemists and pottery workers in the production during the second half of the 19th century. Now, Minton and Company was a phenomenal publicity machine. They dominated the Majolica market and much of the English critical press, taking credit for what many consider to be the greatest invention in ceramics in the 19th century. And although Majolica is often considered a British success story, there was a strong French presence in the Majolica that was made in the British ceramic industry. Now, we must remember that there was a steady migration of French painters, sculptors, and designers into England, and they really helped to shape the artistic output of the many ceramic firms in the Isles. So pervasive was the French influence that by the time of the London International Exhibition of 1862, a newspaper editorial remarked ironically, quote, that nearly all the merit of the principal English departments is due to the Frenchmen employed. This symposium, organized, as you know, with the opening of our show, Majolica Mania, Transatlantic Pottery in England and the United States, 1850 to 1915, expands the geographic scope of the exhibition by exploring the cultural, aesthetic, and commercial implications of the interdependence between English Majolica manufacturers and French artisans. 5 scholars, including myself, will present papers that elucidate aspects of this Anglo-French alliance, including an examination of the community of French artists that emerged in Stoke-upon-Trent, Staffordshire, which will be our first paper today. So to start off the papers, I would like to introduce you to Earl Martin, who is a long-term curator here at the Bard Graduate Center. He is one of the co-curators of Majolica Mania, and he will now introduce our first speaker and the rest of the speakers today. So welcome, Earl.
Thank you, Susan. Our first speaker today will be Miranda Goodbye, and Miranda will be speaking on, as it says, the French community in Stoke-on-Trent. Miranda is a senior curator of ceramics at the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery in Stoke-on-Trent, Staffordshire, and studied the history of design and visual arts at Staffordshire University before doing her graduate qualification studies at Manchester University. She's worked for a wide variety of English museums, small and large, including the British Museum, but since 1995 has been in charge of the ceramics collection at the Potteries Museum, where she curates the largest collection of Staffordshire pottery in the world, over 30,000 pieces dating to the 17th century and to the present, from the 17th century to the present. She has spoken widely and contributed to many articles to ceramic journals, as well as to exhibition catalogs, including our very own Majolica Mania catalog, where she has 2 chapters. She is particularly interested in 18th and early 19th century Staffordshire earthenwares and stonewares, the development of the Staffordshire pottery industry from the 1750s forward, and the lives of pottery workers. In 2015, she was closely involved with the acquisition of the Minton factory archive by the city of Stoke-on-Trent, which we, of course, drew upon heavily in our research, and has begun exploring the archive and to understand and interpret the Potteries Museum's own collections.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm assuming that you can all hear and see me. And I would first of all just like to say thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this symposium. It's a great honour, and I'm only sorry not to be able to be with you in person today, but international circumstances have made that impossible, sadly. To make a start. From the 1840s onwards, for a period of approximately 30 years, numerous French artists arrived in Stoke-on-Trent to work in the potteries there as modellers, designers and painters. Some were freelance artists, some were salaried workers. A number stayed for only a few years, while others made Stoke-on-Trent their lifelong home. Their influence on ceramic design was not confined simply to the companies that they worked for, but also through the apprentices that they trained, and in many cases their involvement with the schools of design in Stoke-on-Trent. The French community in the 19th century was made up of scores of individuals and their families. There were also numerous Germans, Austrians, Hungarians and Italians who were drawn to work in the district. Employed either directly on a free or on a freelance basis by many of the pottery factories in Stoke-on-Trent, they often supplied designs to several Staffordshire firms at the same time. And many of them also designed for other manufacturing industries across the UK. So their influence was greater than simply that of the pottery industry. Depending on the popularity of their work, some of the designs by these French artists were in production for 20 years or more. The subject is potentially huge, but today I want to look at just a small number of the French artists who were chiefly associated with the Minton factory in the mid-19th century. In part, this is because Minton led the way in bringing French designers to Stoke-on-Trent and giving them almost free rein in what they produced. And in part because the Minton factory archive, now housed at the Stoke-on-Trent City Archive, is so rich in material. The city of Stoke-on-Trent today is made up from 6 small towns, as you can see shown on this map of 1776, with a scattering of smaller villages between. Today, the area covers an area approximately 12 miles long and 3 miles wide, from Tunstall, the top left, through Burslem, Hanley, Stoke-upon-Trent, Fenton and Longton. It's a sort of long, ribbony development. It's situated in the heart of the county of Staffordshire and is about as far from the sea and its shipping ports as you can get in England. Yet, from the early 18th century onwards, its abundance of clay and coal has meant it was the centre of the British pottery industry, earning the region the title of the Potteries. With hundreds of factories, many built alongside the canal that bisects the district and links it to the coast. It employed tens of thousands of men, women and children, and until recently had the factories distinctive coal-fired bottle ovens dominating the landscape, as you can see in this illustration from the 1840s. Yet in the 19th century, this small industrial region drew scores of artists, sculptors, modellers and designers, as well as chemists and engineers from across Europe, but particularly from France, to work in its factories. Could I have the next slide, please? There were a handful of foreign artists working in Stoke-on-Trent in the late 18th century, among them Fidèle de Vivier, the painter, who worked briefly for various factories in Staffordshire between 1783 and 1790, and Pierre Stéphane, a modeller from Tournai, and his sons, who were in Stoke-on-Trent between 1776 and 1805, working as freelance modellers and producing designs for several factories, including that of Josiah Wedgwood editorial. But they were the exceptions. In the main, the industry relied on native talent for the design and decoration of its wares. But at the same time, potters from Stoke-on-Trent were travelling to work in France, where their technical skills were in demand at the many earthenware factories that were being established there to make English-style earthenwares, or faience fine. Although the Napoleonic Wars certainly interrupted this cross-fertilisation of pottery skills, the baton was picked up again as soon as peace was restored in 1815. And indeed, looking at the 1851 census for Stoke-on-Trent for foreign artists and their families, the 51 census being the first to give the place of birth of individuals, I was surprised to see a number of Stoke-on-Trent residents who had been born in France between 1815 and 1850. In almost all cases, their fathers were skilled potters, including mould makers and engravers, who had been employed in French factories, such as the one at Cray, for a few years before returning to Staffordshire. And may we have the next slide, please? So the massive influx of French specialists to Stoke-on-Trent in the mid-19th century didn't simply come out of the blue. Instead, there was a modest but well-established tradition of the exchange of skilled workers between England and France. And with foreign modellers and decorators who had trained and worked in European pottery factories, knowing about Staffordshire and knowing that the pottery industry there was rapidly expanding and would welcome the modelling and the design skills that they could bring. What is impressive is the number of French artists, sculptors and designers who made their homes in Stoke-on-Trent from the 1840s onwards, and how many of them had undergone a formal fine art education in Paris, rather than learning their skills in a pottery factory, as was usual with the British decorators and modellers at the time. The political upheavals of the mid-19th century in continental Europe helped to make England an attractive destination to French artists. England was seen as a politically and economically stable country, with an accepting and laissez-faire attitude to incomers. And it is surely no coincidence that the two great influences of European artists, Staffordshire, particularly French artists, coincided with the Euro revolutions in 1848 and the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. Next slide, please. And while it might seem that these French designers were making a great leap of faith in coming to work in a small, remote, provincial industrial centre, it is important to remember that at this period, the Staffordshire pottery industry was expanding rapidly. Its extensive export trade, which was worldwide, meant that the area was full of money. New civic and commercial developments were springing up across the 6 towns, and these are just views of ones happening in Stoke-upon-Trent, where the Minton factory was based. Thanks to the railway, the district was now only 4 hours away from London by steam engine, and there were dozens of first-rate factories in the district, all seeking to gain a commercial and artistic advantage over each other, and they were all very close together. Next slide, please. As this map of 1832 shows, the great Victorian firms of Minton, shown with the 2 factories in blue, Spode in red, and what was later to become the factory of George Jones, obviously didn't exist in 1832, and shown in green, were within sight of each other, certainly well within a quarter of a mile from one end of the town to the other. The firms of Wedgwood, Brownfield, Brown Westhead Moore and Company, again all great manufacturers of Majolica in the mid-19th century, were only a mile or so away. If an artist wasn't happy at one firm, another firm only a short walk away would be only too glad to employ him, either full-time or on a freelance basis. And if Stoke-on-Trent proved to be just too provincial to live in full-time, well, there was a good national postal service and an excellent train service to London, and models could be sent up on approval, and frequently were. Although early Victorian manufacturers in pottery and other materials were fully convinced of British superiority in technical matters, there was by the 1830s a strong and well-established sense that the French were superior in matters of design and ornamental work. And it was becoming widely recognised that there was a serious dearth of formal design training in Britain. In 1836, a government report noted the urgent need for art instruction amongst the industrial workers of England if the country was to be able to compete with its European rivals, particularly the French. The following year, a government-funded School of Design was established in London, and within a few years, similar schools of design were set up in many of the major British manufacturing centres. And it was stressed that such schools should concentrate on not theoretical instruction alone, but that the direct application of the arts to manufactures ought to be deemed an essential element. John Lewis Ricardo, Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent, also felt strongly on the subject. In 1845, he published an article in the Art Union Journal urging the setting up of a school of design for the district. He said, "A great advance has been made by the competitors of the English potters, and that as they are far behind us in the mechanisation of potting, this advance is mainly to be attributed to the care and attention which they bestow upon art and design. So let us not disdain to profit by their good example. Let us not shut our eyes to the advantage, if not the necessity, of learning from them valuable lessons in the means of developing and encouraging artistic talent. Of all the manufacturing interests of Great Britain, the potteries are the most dependent on art." Next slide, please. Following this, the Potter's School of Design was set up in 1847 with the support of the leading pottery manufacturers, including, crucially, that of Herbert Minton. The new school had 2 venues, one in Stoke, where, coincidentally, Minton's factory was based, and one in nearby Hamley. And the following year, the French sculptor Pierre-Émile Geneste, who was already working at the Minton factory, was appointed modelling instructor. Geneste, who had previously been based in London, had been brought to Stoke by Herbert Minton to produce models for his factory, initially in the newly developed Parian body, but subsequently in various earthenware and porcelain bodies, both for ornamental and useful wares, including, of course, Majolica. Next slide, please. He replaced Minton's existing chief modeller, Samuel Bourne, of whom it was said his designs always attained considerable commercial success, and was the first of the numerous French artists to be directly employed by Minton at his factory while resident in the town. Geneste's appointment marked the beginning of a complete change of direction in the Minton firm's design ethos. Rather than the pretty, refined, revived Rococo style that was typical of its output under Bourne in the 1830s and early 1840s, it developed a much more vigorous and robust sculptural style that was to be perfectly complemented by the glazes and colours developed by the firm's great art director, Leon Arnoux. Next slide, please. Geneste's appointment was seen as a great coup, not just for Minton, but for the industry as a whole. Despite being described as a district of 1,000 artists, there was at this period no formal art education available in the area. Those wealthy enough to do so could employ private drawing masters, but the majority of pottery employees were expected to learn on the job during their apprenticeship from their colleagues who had learnt in the same way. As a result, students, male and female, quickly signed up to the day and evening classes that the schools of design offered. Next slide, please. Geneste's appointment was just what the industry needed. Reginald Hagger, himself a designer at Minton in the 1930s, wrote of this period. In estimating the influence of the art schools on Staffordshire ceramics, the persistence of craft dynasties, such as the Bournes, the Burkes, the Reeds, the Tofts, and many other local factors who were employed at both Minton's and elsewhere, must be considered. The family traditions, working within the limits of a circumscribed area and one industry, tended to inertia in design. Geneste's arrival and that of the French sculptors who followed him in teaching at the local schools of art shook up this complacency, introduced new methods, new ways of looking, and new styles, and had a profound effect on the approach to design of the young students who were exposed to these new influences. In the report of the Hanley Design School's prize giving in 1848, the local newspaper reported that the models in clay are the first productions of the class which has recently commenced under the superintendence of Monsieur Émile Geneste. The present results of little more than 1 month's tuition has already excited universal admiration. The models are chiefly studies from the antique, there being likewise several original compositions or adaptations of ornament. A subsequent newspaper account named the modelling prize winners. They included young men who had become notable designers, particularly at Minton, such as Charles Toft, George Burkes, and Thomas Kirkby, all of whom did work for Minton, and Henry Brownsword of the Wedgwood factory. Next slide, please. Geneste's time at Stoke was brief, however. By March 1851, he had moved to Birmingham to work for the silversmiths at Elkington, and he died there 6 years later, aged only 44. Nonetheless, during his period in England, he produced a wide range of designs for Minton, and according to his obituary in the Art Journal, during the whole period of his engagement in Birmingham, he continued from time to time to design and model for Messrs. Minton, and some of the finest reproductions of Majolica were exhibited by this firm at the Paris exhibition of 1855, and which called forth so much laudation with the work of Monsieur Geneste. And I'm delighted that since we sent this piece over for the exhibition here in New York, that Earl has been able to confirm that this piece was in fact designed by Geneste and painted by Thomas Kirkby, one of the prize winners in 1848. Next slide, please. Geneste was replaced in the spring of 1851 at both the Minton factory and as modelling instructor at the School of Design by the young Albert Ernest Carrier-Belleuse, only 27 years of age, and a rising sculptor who had recently moved to England. However, despite being warmly received locally and his models for Minton being hugely successful, like Geneste, he decided quite quickly that Stoke-on-Trent was not where he wanted to make his long-term home. Have the next slide, please. He left Stoke in 1855, putting the contents of his house and studio up for auction, and returned to France to continue his career as a sculptor. And I think this advertisement from the Staffordshire Advertiser is particularly interesting. Not only does it include his oil paintings, engravings, statuary, foreign ornaments, Sèvres china, a splendid orc, which is apparently some sort of harmonium, casting a nice light on the domestic life of the Carrier-Belleuze family. But if you look a little further down, you will also see his models, blocks, and moulds. It would be very nice to know whether there was a taker for those, and if so, where they ended up. However, even after he had left Stoke-on-Trent, like Jeunesse before him, Carrier-Belleuze continued to supply Minton and several other pottery manufacturers, including Wedgwood, Copeland, Mayer Brothers, and Brownfields, with a variety of models. In 1876, he became artistic director of the Sèvres factory, where he remained until his death. However, as before, he continued to supply Minton with designs, and in 1881 entered into an agreement with them to design and supply models exclusively for Minton. Next slide, please. The contract, in which he was paid an agreed fee and 10% of the wholesale price for each item sold, and a number of receipted invoices, survive in the Minton archive. And could we have the detail for this slide, please? Thank you. And as you can see there, Mintons were to cover the transport of the models from Paris to Stoke-on-Trent in good order, and that they were as intended. Then he would receive 50% of the fee at that point, the remainder to follow. And you can see on the right-hand side a receipt for 2 models, one a corbeille, a basket, 2 figures, £200, 50% of which being £100, and a lamp also with 2 figures, priced at £150. These were not inexpensive. They were incredibly expensive, in fact. And the fact that Mintons felt it was worthwhile to pay for this sum of money, plus taking on the risks of the transport of these pieces, shows how commercially important Carrier-Belleuze's designs were to the success of their firm, particularly not just for the Majolica, which was so successful commercially, but also for the Parian figures and ornaments that he was producing. This idea of an exclusive arrangement with an artist to use their designs was not uncommon. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, few of these contracts survive, but in the Minton archive, there is one dated 1881 between the firm and Louis Maigret, another artist at that point resident in England, but in fact in London rather than living in Stoke-on-Trent. And this was to reproduce in Parian his figure of the Awakening of Aurora. And as you can see, the terms of this agreement at 7% are not as generous as the arrangements with Carrier-Belleuze, whose work was much more highly regarded and commercially much more successful and therefore important to the Minton firm. Next slide, please. Carrier-Belleuze was succeeded at Minton by the sculptor and designer Hugh Protat, who, like his predecessors, combined designing for Minton with the role of modelling instructor at the Stoke-on-Trent School of Art from 1856. Protat was hugely popular with his students and colleagues at the School of Art, and there was an effusive article in the local newspaper detailing the presentation to him of a piece of Majolica by his students when he left Stoke in 1862, having produced a number of designs that were shown at the International Exhibition in London in the same year. He moved to London, from where he continued to supply designs to Minton, Wedgwood, and other potters until his return to France in the mid-1870s. So by this time, from 1848 to 1862, students, male and female, at Stoke-on-Trent were able to study under excellent French classically trained sculptors. They were learning methods which had never been taught before in Stoke-on-Trent, and they were being exposed to an international range of styles and influences. Next slide, please. Of course, the most influential of all the French employees at Minton during this period, and the man who was to become pivotal to the success of the firm, was Léon Arnoux. Arnoux had come to England as a young man of 32, having joined Minton, remained in Stoke-on-Trent for the rest of his life. He was not only an experienced factory manager, but was also an excellent chemist, a qualified engineer, and a skilled ceramic artist who had worked at Sèvres. In his obituary, Arnoux was described quite reasonably as the man who made Minton, and certainly it is impossible to imagine that the firm would have had the success that it did without Arnoux' contribution. He was engaged in 1848, initially to develop and improve new ceramic bodies, but before too long, however, he had taken on additional responsibilities. As George and Frederick Reed stated in their book Staffordshire Pots and Potters, next slide please. Monsieur Arnoux was originally engaged as a potter and a chemist, but his perfect knowledge of the decorative capacity of colours, bodies, and materials, coupled with his exquisite taste, led to his being appointed to the dual position of potter and art director. His career is indelibly connected with Minton's. Their triumphs are his and his theirs. Never evincing any great originality, he appears to have delighted in the solution of ceramic problems of past potters, hitherto considered insoluble, and also in the reproduction of processes declared to be out of the reach of the modern potter. He reproduced the palette of Sèvres, the inlays of Orient, the enamels of Persia, and the Majolicas of Italy. The post of art director was unknown in the Staffordshire potteries until the title was given to Arnoux. Indeed, in the 1851 national census, Arnoux described himself not as art director, but as civil engineer, something that perhaps reflects the Reed's comment that he delighted in the solution of ceramic problems. In 1861, he called himself manager at pottery manufactory, and it was not until the census of 1871 that he actually called himself art director, Minton Manufactory. The title of art director may originally have been a delicate way of not offending the Minton factory's chief designer, who had held the post from the 1820s to the 1860s. But by the end of the 19th century, all the major Staffordshire pottery factories had their own art directors in emulation of Minton. By the time of the 1862 International Exhibition in London, the dominance of French artists in British design and manufacturing was the subject of a long article in the French newspaper Le Constitutionnel, which Susan referred to earlier, and which was widely reproduced in a number of English newspapers. Written in the form of a conversation between two French visitors to the exhibition, the article demonstrated that the success of the English manufacturers across all media was entirely due to the impact of French designers. Next slide, please. The writer and his companion visited the Minton stand. "Look," I said, "is it possible to find a more complete collection of splendid vases, of admirably modelled groups, of finer material, or of purer designs and better shaded colours?" "True," my companion replied with a smile, "but all the best and finest are due to French artists. It is the indifferent descriptions which are of native manufacture." The writer inquired why this should be, and the response was, "At every political and social perturbation that takes place in France, numbers of skillful artists and clever workmen are scattered abroad. In 1848, for example, English pottery, although making great progress, was 100 years from what it is now. But under the shock of that immense commotion, French artists, who were for the most part reduced to a difficult existence, turned their steps principally towards England. That country opened her arms to them and remunerated them magnificently, while turning their talent to account." Next slide, please. Who was it that placed Minton at such an elevated position in the industrial solemnity of the period? Around, from the Sèvres manufactory, Genet and 10 other Frenchmen who had voluntarily exiled themselves. You see that splendid vase there, Minton's principal piece? It is by Carrier. The candelabra are by Eugène Phoenix, and the others by Hugh Trotter. And after many other examples showing how the success of furniture design, bronze work, carving, sculpture, textile design, etc., are all the results of French artists, the writer then asks his companion why these French designers should leave their homeland to teach their secrets to the British, and receives a simple yet devastating answer. "My dear sir, your simplicity surprises me. Where Paris pays 3,000 francs a year, England pays from 15,000 to 20,000 francs. Now, it is always difficult to compare historical monetary values, and even allowing for a degree of exaggeration by the writer of the article, but in the 1860s, 3,000 francs would have been roughly equivalent to £120 per annum or £10 a month, while 15,000 francs would have been the equivalent of almost £600 per annum. Certainly, as far as the Minton factory was concerned, very few French artists approached this princely salary. Even Antonin Boulemier, one of the factory's premier artists, was only earning £400 per annum in the early 1870s. However, this should be put into context with what the English artists at the same factory were earning. Thomas Kirkby, who had painted the Jardinière, exhibited at the Paris exhibition of 1855, earned £156 per annum, less than half of Boulemier's salary. And Charles Toft, creator of the hugely elaborate and time-consuming Henri II wares, only £104 per annum. The second great wave of French artists to be taken on by Minton and other Staffordshire factories took place in the early 1870s when artists arrived such as Marc-Louis Solon, Antonin Boulemier, Désiré Leroy, and many others. The Franco-Prussian War meant that many French artists and a number of German artists who'd been working in France for many years, such as William Mussel and Charles Hurton, were happy to leave for England. Their arrival was helped by the links between the migrants and their fellow countrymen already established across the Channel in England, and not necessarily those who were resident in Stoke. According to a letter in the St James Gazette of 1890, Hugh Protac, who still had links with Minton throughout the 1870s, kept an open house in London for French refugees during the Commune. This second wave of artists was larger, and in general, its members stayed in Stoke for the remainder of their careers, unlike many of the early migrants. And although most were French, there was also a significant number of German and Austrian artists, such as Ludwig Jahn, who rapidly started calling himself the more French-sounding Louis Jahn once he arrived at Minton. At the Minton factory, the French-speaking artists were well embedded in the daily life of the factory. Their studios and workshops were alongside those of their English colleagues. They were mentoring and supervising their locally born apprentices, and many of them were involved in formal and informal teaching at the Stoke School of Art, which, from the late 1850s, was based in the Minton Memorial Building directly in front of the factory. Occasionally, they also provided a source of amusement and mild scandal to the locals. Next slide, please. One was the modeller Victor Simeon, who made quite an impact amongst the local populace for his behaviour. Artistically, he is most famous for his Prometheus or captive vase, which was shown at the 1867 Paris exhibition. But locally, he was remembered for, among other things, his habit of wandering at night to the outskirts of the town, seating himself in the branches of a tree and playing the French horn to himself. It's something which was unlikely to have endeared him to the nearby residents, and it certainly startled passers-by. Paul Comolera was another French artist widely regarded by the Staffordshire potters as eccentric. May we have the next slide, please? Among other oddities, he turned his studio into a menagerie for the animals which he modelled and of which he was passionately fond. And it was one of these animals that led to a great row that was long remembered at the Minton factory. As told by Frederick Reed some years later, who was an apprentice to Marc-Louis Solon at the time, Monsieur Comolera had a splendid Persian cat which he modelled in the form of a jug, and which was the hero of the great Comolera-Boulemier epic, which provided matter for conversation and amusement on the Minton pottery for many months. The facts told baldly are these. Comolera, on the occasion of taking a holiday, left his cat in charge of the Boulemier family with a sum of money for an abundant daily supply of milk, together with elaborate instructions for its treatment. The cat was greatly attached to Monsieur Comolera and fretted in its new quarters. Boulemier, the kindest of men, was greatly concerned. The cat visibly deteriorated in physique, and neither blandishment nor strategy availed to induce the animal to eat and drink, although pans and saucers of milk were repeatedly placed in its path. Comolera, upon his return, observing the condition of his cat, denounced Boulemier as a traitor and a brigand. Explanations were useless, were totally ignored. Boulemier was contemptuously charged with embezzling the money supplied for the milk, or, which to Boulemier was the unkindest insult of all, of drinking it himself. Boulemier lost his temper, applied the epithet gamin, dashed down a sum of money to the ground, and turned on his heel. The money was returned on a shovel carried by an unkempt boy from Boulemier's studio, The quarrel intensified, was carried on in public, and to the intense disappointment of the bystanders, largely in the French language. Eventually, Lemier, clenching his fists, exclaimed loudly in English, "No, come out like an Englishman and fight in the English fashion." The invitation was declined, and the public part of the affair ended here, owing to the discreet intervention of Monsieur Arnoux. Poor Arnoux, not only responsible for developing new colours and glazes, overseeing the entire artistic direction of the company and developing the Minton patent kiln, but also forced to descend from these Olympian heights in order to smooth the ruffled feathers of his fellow countrymen. In general, however, the French artists only brought prestige to their English employers. They were remunerated accordingly and consequently formed an elite group within the potteries. New housing sprang up for these well-paid artists. Within walking distance of the Minton and Copeland factories, but at a discreet distance from their increasing smoke, was the Villas, an elegant gated community where Leon Arnoux and Marc-Louis Solon lived. A few streets closer to the town were rows of newly built large terraces where many more of the foreign artists and their servants lived, adjacent to the senior managers of their firms and other professionals. And one can imagine the scene as these multilingual German, French, and Italian artists all left their houses to walk to work in mornings, chatting together and passing the local workers. However, if they tended to live close to each other, and indeed the families often intermarried, their wider influence in the district was great. The sons and grandsons of the French migrants were largely apprenticed to the pottery industry, often to their father's employer, and frequently rose to important positions within the factory in their own right, with many then moving on to senior positions at other pottery firms. To give just a couple of examples, Antonin Lemier's British-born sons, Lucien and Henry, both succeeded their father as principal painter at Minton, although Lucien was to leave the firm to join the Lennox Pottery in America before returning to the UK, where he became art director at Mailings Pottery in Newcastle upon Tyne for 17 years. At the same period, 3 of Marc-Louis Solon's sons were working for Minton, with one of them, Leon Solon, named for his maternal grandfather, Leon Arnoux, ultimately rising to the position of art director that his grandfather had first established. New slide, please. But by the early 20th century, the relatively small and close-knit group of French migrant artists, modelers, and designers that had dominated much of the Staffordshire pottery industry since the late 1840s was gradually dissolving, either by retirement or death. Their influence continued to be felt, but was declining as Majolica fell out of fashion, styles changed, and the artists and their families were increasingly anglicised and assimilated into local society. Throughout their time in Stoke-on-Trent, the older generation had held important roles in most of the leading firms. They'd taken many apprentices from local families, and these apprentices, as well as the migrants' own sons and grandsons, had in their turn taken those techniques and skills to other firms. The French artists had also continued to be involved in art education, and their students, now with a formal design education in drawing and modelling, had applied those skills not just to the expanding pottery industry in Stoke-on-Trent, but across the UK to the USA and further afield, spreading their influence throughout the wider pottery industry. Next slide, please. Their impact on the mid-19th century pottery industry had been great. It had enabled a pottery industry made up from numerous firms which, unlike some of the great European factories such as Sèvres, had no state support and that succeeded or failed entirely on the profits that they made. It had enabled that industry to not just hold its own, but to succeed magnificently on the international stage, both critically through its successes at the international exhibitions and commercially from the 1850s to the 1900s. Within 100 years, the pottery industry in Stoke-on-Trent had gone from being something which had a worldwide export trade to something which was widely respected and massively larger, as you can see from this photograph here of the Minton factory in the 1940s, surrounded by industry compared to what it had been in the 1840s when it was surrounded by fields. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miranda. So we'll take any questions from our audience here. I have a question. Miranda, why do you think the like Minton would compensate Moulmeyer or the other French artists so much more highly? Sorry, I can take this off. Than their native-born sort of prodigies, almost the Kirkbys and the Toffs, when they were creating sort of equivalently extravagant objects.
I think one of the reasons that the French artists are so much more highly paid is partly to keep them at Minton, to stop them being poached by the other factories who perhaps couldn't afford to pay such high wages in the first instance. Wedgwood certainly was able to take quite a number of artists from Minton, but very few other factories were in a position to pay what were premier rates. And why they paid the English artists less? Well, I think there was also that sense with a lot of the artists working in different factories, a lot of the English artists working in factories was that they'd always worked there, their families had always worked there, and that was where they should work. I know that sounds incredibly parochial, but it was something that went right through to the 20th century. You would start working for a factory because other members of your family worked there, and you would remain loyal to that factory. It was normally a very large payment, rising wages that encouraged people to move on. But I think one of the reasons that the French artists were paid so much was to prevent them being poached by Minton's rivals.
Thank you. Susan?
Do you know of any French artists who went to America?
Oh, gosh. I haven't considered that one. I mean, obviously, Lucien Bellemier, who was the next generation down, went to America. But if any went directly from Staffordshire to France, I'm not aware of that. It would be wonderful to think that there were some, but I'm certainly not aware of that. A lot of Staffordshire artists, of course, went and worked both in the Majolica factories and in Trenton and earlier in East Liverpool. I'm not aware of any of the French ones going directly, not the first generation French artists anyway.
Nicholas?
Were there ever any signs of political tension or just tension between firms, considering that Carrier-Belleuse still supplied models to Minton while he was working at Sèvres?
Sorry, could you just repeat that? There's a lot of echo in the room.
Was there still between Minton and Sèvres, considering that Carrier-Belleuse was still supplying models to Minton, even when he went back to France and was working at Sèvres?
I'm not aware of that. I mean, I think you'd have to ask somebody who knows about the archives at Sèvres as to whether there was any tension. I think a lot of the approach for the Staffordshire factories was purely commercial. You know, if we could get exclusive usage of particular designs, that's great. Carrier-Belleuse has a fabulous reputation. He's a French artist. He's in charge at Sèvres. He's highly regarded. It is casting luster on what we are producing by being able to attach his name to it. The fact that he's also working for Sèvres was probably seen as sort of an endorsement of Minton's decision to keep being supplied by him. What the Sèvres factory might have thought about it, I don't know. It would be interesting to find out.
So we have one question from our Zoom attendee. Thank you for the fascinating talk, Miranda. I'm interested in pulling out French expatriates in this discussion versus other international artisans. Have you found it helpful to think of artistic contribution related to the nationality of the artisans? If so, could you explain why?
Have I found it? What I missed a word in that, the vital one. Looking it up.
Have you found it helpful to think of artistic contribution related to their nationality of these artisans?
It's not something I've considered because so many of the German and Austrian, Bohemian artists who came over to England had already trained or worked in France. Charles Hurton, who was German by birth, was described by his son-in-law, Frederick Reed, as being French by education. He'd moved there at the age of 18, married, had worked there. Wenceslas Mussel, who was from Bohemia, had been working at the Sèvres factory. It was such an international movement. If you had those skills, you did indeed learn that international language of design. What's interesting by comparison is the newspaper reports of the time saying that with all this continental and particularly French interest, the native Saxon style of design of England was likely to be swamped, and that this was potentially a bad thing. And in fact, one of the comments that you get towards the end of the century is the fact that they're glad to see that English design ethos has gradually reasserted itself despite all this continental influence in the middle of the 19th century. So I'm not aware of it being particularly sort of Germanic or Bohemian or Austrian, simply because those artists were moving around so much and being so much influenced. And frequently, if not physically moving around, supplying people in different countries with their designs. They all seem to have got on very well when they arrived in Stoke-on-Trent. You would think in the early 1870s, when you've got French, German, Austrian artists all turning up in France, there might have been a little political tension, but actually they all seem to get on very well. It was the French that seemed to fall out amongst themselves.
And sorry, we have Ellen Danker joining us from our Zoom audience. And she wanted just to let everyone know that Simon Lissam, a Franco-Russe artist, who had designed for Sèvres, also designed for Lenox in the mid-1930s. So in the 1930s, though, after our 19th century period.
Yeah.
And any last questions in the room? No? Oh, Andrew.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. That was great.
Thank you.
I just had a question about the Prometheus vase.
Yes.
Prometheus vase, which exists in so many different and very elaborated versions. And I just wondered about the artistic control that the original designer had over those variants. Do we know?
No, as far as I'm aware, Simeon went back to, well, left Stoke-on-Trent quite early. He was in there for a few years. I don't know how late the last version of the Prometheus vase is that was published or that was produced. But you're absolutely right, from the sort of plain turquoise bodied one, which is quite restrained and really makes the most of the modeling of the handles and so forth, through to the sort of fully painted ones with sort of historicist decoration. And then the unique one with the sgraffito decoration, which to my mind fights the form of the vase and doesn't complement it in the slightest. I can't imagine that that was something that Simeon had any control over. Unfortunately, although the Minton archive is extremely full in certain areas, there's great areas where you just so much want the information and it wasn't preserved. Pattern books, shape books, wages books, exhibition books, listing what was going to be produced and how much the cost was for those pieces. Fantastic. Comparatively speaking, much, much less to understand the daily workings of the factory, unfortunately. Great shame. I can't imagine that Simeon had a great deal of say over the decoration.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Miranda. We're going to move
Pleasure.
on to our next speaker. If I can do this. Go. So our next speaker is Dr. Susan Weber, and I don't think I need to reintroduce her, so she will just come right up. And let me make sure. There we go.
So first, a few caveats. My slides are not beautiful and luscious because so much of this research I had to do for this talk was done from secondary sources. and I was not able to travel to Sèvres, to the manufactory and museum because of COVID, as you can imagine. Second, I would love to thank the director of Heritage and Collections at the Manufactory and the Musée de Sèvres, my friend and colleague, Charlotte Vignon, and her archivists for doing the extraordinary and looking through some of the archives for me to find details and sources that I knew existed there but couldn't get my hands on. So it is my hope that I will be able to travel to France very soon and continue work on this subject. So I'm basically considering this talk a rough draft since I have not had firsthand access to the archives. So as you know, much scholarship on the subject of Majolica has centered on the production of Minton Company, Britain's leading ceramics manufacturer. The firm's introduction of Majolica was largely due to Leon Arnault, and you see a portrait plaque of him. He was, as you know, a French chemist and artist who had previously worked at Sèvres. The Sèvres influence on Minton Majolica has been explored by such eminent curators as Rebecca Wallace, who writes in her essay, Majolica Sources of Inspiration, published in our Majolica Mania catalog, that, quote, the Sèvres influence on Minton Majolica led to some of the English firm's most fantastical examples, such as its brown, green, and yellow lead-glazed interpretations of the Sèvres vase Greca rosette made in about 1765. The reverse influence of Minton Majolica on Sèvres, however, is a little studied facet of 19th century Sèvres production. What is even less known is that the manufactory of Sèvres under the Second Empire had a separate workshop for the making of earthenware and Majolica, referred to as faience and terre vernissée in the manufactory's records. This workshop produced large basins, garden vases, decorative platters, compote skewers, medallion busts, and figural groups. Two examples which you see before you. Yet the number of designs, probably close to 100 in Majolica, did not compare with Minton's widespread production of this colorful earthenware. No tableware was made in Majolica at Sèvres, only ornamental work, much of it for the government to use or to offer as diplomatic gifts. These, for the most part, were adaptations of earlier Sèvres designs, since the factory had kept many of its old models, which they were able to use again and use again. This little explored atelier was in operation for 20 years, from 1852 to 1872. Throughout this period, it was mostly associated with imperial commissions, including earthenware vases for the gardens at the Trianon and the kitchen garden at Versailles for Napoleon III, a subject explored by Gabriel Lamy in an article for the Revue de la Société des Amis du National de Céramique in 2009, who's an example from the article, and the first page of the article I show you here. Sèvres also made faience vessels imitating marble, porphyry, or even bronzes. Work inspired by Renaissance Majolica were part of its output as well. The atelier opened a year after Minton unveiled its Majolica at London's Great Exhibition of 1851, at which the Sèvres Royal Manufactory also had a major display. Its porcelains were described as remarkable, especially for their scale and high quality. But it was Minton's Majolica that proved to be the sensation of the Great Exhibition. The Sèvres manufactory quickly went to work. Examples of faience purchased by the factory for its reference collection were already available to study by its designers, decorators, and makers. Founded in the early 19th century by Alexander Brunyard, director of the manufactory, This collection of historical and contemporary ceramics became the first museum dedicated to the fine ceramic arts in the world. Minton followed this initiative and developed a study collection for its artists and craftspeople in Staffordshire. A Della Robbia baluster vase from the 16th century in an oval cobalt blue made its way into the Sèvres collection and was studied and imitated. A number of Italian Majolica platters and plates from the factories at Doccia, Pizarro, Gubbio, and others were added to the collection. One of the highlights was a Gubbio imitation dish of a 16th century Renaissance Majolica plate depicting Cupid holding a fox by the tail from the workshop of Giorgio Andreoli. A French Majolica rubellware plate with a French green floral center and yellow basket weave rim was also purchased. What is most surprising is the Sèvres Museum's possession of a Minton cashpo in Majolica. In 1860, Colin Minton Campbell reported that, quote, during the Paris exhibition of 1855, there was a very large amount for it, Majolica, so much that they began to copy it at Sèvres. He further recounted that, quote, when I was at Sèvres last year, the first model they showed me was an exact copy of a vase which we produced and exhibited in 1851. That was their latest novelty in the material. The Sèvres vase in question was made in lead-glazed earthenware and called the vase Minton, copied from Minton's ram's head and festoon garden pot and stand, shape number 727, which Herbert Minton gave to the French factory shortly after the Great Exhibition of 1851. An entry for vase Minton shape number 65 is documented in the Sèvres shapebook circa 1858 and is before you. A Sèvres example copied from this model of fluted campana shape originally designed by Baron Carlo Marichetti with dark blue glaze and goat head side handles linked by swags of flowers and fruit in high relief and colors upon a laurel leaf and berry garland appeared in the antiques trade in 2006. It was incised on the circular molded foot, capital M, capital I, de Sèvres, 1858. A comparison of the Minton prototype and the Sèvres rendition that you see before you shows minor differences. The Sèvres everted rim and foot rim is not overpainted green, and the swag of fruit and flowers is more densely modeled and decorated than the Minton model. On the whole, the Sèvres coloring is more subtle and the gradooning of the body has more movement. So why did Sèvres pursue Majolica, a typically mass-produced product, when the firm was widely considered the most successful porcelain manufacturer worldwide? It must be remembered that many French artists and workmen fled to England in 1848. Sèvres briefly lost Émile Lesueur and Carrier Belleuse, among other talents. Although France was deemed superior in the aesthetic domain, England was trying very hard to catch up. By the 1850s, the French realized that they were losing status and profits due to the Majolica output associated with Minton. In the foreign reports, they wrote, quote, England is our competitor by carrying off our designers. For many years, our manufactories have attracted them by the high wages with which their services are remunerated. But it is a very remarkable fact that these artists have often lost, after sojourning some time on the other side of the channel, the superiority of taste by which they were previously distinguished. This rivalry between Minton and Sèvres was manifested in the ceramic displays shown at the International Exhibition of the 1850s and 1860s. Sèvres first exhibited its Majolica at the Paris Exposition Universelle of 1855, held on the Champs-Élysées from May 15th to November 15th. It was a major event organized under the newly crowned Emperor Napoleon III. This was one of the many 19th century fairs at which European countries showed the finest and often largest of their contemporary art and industrial products. A page from the Illustrated London News documents the Sèvres display with its varied porcelain creations set amidst Gobelin tapestries and surrounding the crown jewels of France. The display was principally vases of hard paste porcelain, along with vessels embellished with new pots or pot decoration. According to the reviewer for the official guide, quote, "The samples exhibited will support the high reputation of the imperial establishment. They are not only grouped among the jewels, but are distributed here and there, filled with flowers amid the flowing draperies. Although I have not been able to find a review or illustration that mentions or features Sèvres Majolica, the factory won the Grand Medal of Honor, and its Majolica was noted as part of its citation of excellence." And you see that on the screen on the right. Now, a large tazza from the exhibition was one of the Sèvres manufactory's Majolica items on view. Purchased from the fair by the South Kensington Museum, renamed, as you know, the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1899. Made in 1854 to 55, the tazza is probably the coupe de gibier. Gibier means game, for which a feuille d'appréciation, which is a worksheet basically, which itemized the cost associated with production dating from 1855, can be found in the Sèvres archive. The coupe is decorated with a ring of lifeless game birds supported by satyrs. A satyr blowing a horn is placed in its central compartment when not in use. This is one of the earliest known examples of Sèvres Majolica. Archival records indicate that it initially sold for 550 francs. Another feuille d'appréciation for 1855 documents the making of a Louis XVI vase de Nicole, created by Joseph Nicole, a trained architect designer and chief of artworks at Sèvres from 1856 to 1871. This piece features a wine-colored ground, of which there are two sets at Fontainebleau. The retail price was 200 francs. An additional costing sheet exists for a vase Leon Faucheur, which is probably a Majolica version of the porcelain vase Arabe of 1852, modeled after an Alhambra vase form with the upright handles pierced and decorated in the Islamic taste. This edition cost 200 francs as well. A memo from 1854 documents the Sèvres designer's study of the many historical pieces that were considered for adaptation in Majolica, probably for the upcoming exhibition in the following year. This list includes such grand works as the Fontainebleau chimney piece, the vase à la vendange, and the coupe palissy. These pieces were probably never realized, and only those with less hand painting and an absence of gilding were created. These considerably less expensive renditions were probably meant to divert attention from Minton's Majolica and attract a different section of the ceramic market than the elite consumers that the Sèvres manufactory had previously targeted. This broadening of the firm's client base had been an objective of Brungyard's 50 years earlier in order to make the factory increasingly more profitable. And here are some of the vases that were made in porcelain that were considered to be made in Majolica as well. At the London International Exhibition of 1862, Sèvres once again exhibited Majolica. The exhibition was held adjacent to the gardens of the Royal Horticultural Society in South Kensington on a site now occupied by the museums. In reference to the Sèvres display, the official catalog noted that, quote, "the best artists of France are employed at Sèvres," and maintain its supremacy over all other works for the production of ceramic art. Reviewers and critics barely mentioned the Sèvres Majolica. Instead, they focused on their porcelains, including the new Celadon ware. The Practical Mechanics Journal, however, did briefly report on the few pieces of Sèvres Majolica exhibited, declaring that, in quote, in form and color, these are of an original character. The South Kensington Museum bought 3 large earthenware vases from the Sèvres display. The first vase has a blue ground decorated with a female mask in relief, flanked by medallion portraits with sphinx-shaped handles. It was called the Vase Louis XV, or Vase au Sphinx de Versailles, and was modeled by Joseph Nicole in 1858. The shape appears to have been a direct copy of a bronze design by Claude Bellin with handles shaped like sphinxes that was made in 1665 for the Portier du Nord et du Midi at the Chateau of Versailles. The second vase featured a brown ground with incised decoration in blue, yellow, and white with mottled goat head handles. Called the Vase de Jardin, it was designed by decorator Hyacinthe Renier and also produced in a blue ground version with white decoration. A similar example at Fontainebleau has yellow and green ground. The brown version at the V&A Museum was perhaps meant to imitate wood or tortoiseshell. The third vase to enter the collection was the Vase Poussin de Versailles with a yellowish gold ground, ray intertwined snake handles, and green vines. A tortoiseshell version was also carried out. The form was derived from a vase of African marble in the King's Garden at the Grand Trianon, dating from 1707, which is today in the Louvre. A faux marble version was also made in porcelain that you see on the far right. This vase was reproduced in the Art Illustrated catalog of the International Exhibition of 1862, along with another example in Majolica called the Vase aux Enfants de Versailles, with handles in the form of winged putti seated on lion heads. This work had a blue ground and was also derived from a bronze model by Claude Bellin of 1668. Vases of this design appear in engravings of the Portier du Nord in the Garden of Versailles by Jean Lepotre, dating from 1672 and 1673. The main difference between the bronze prototype and the Majolica version was the replacement of the arms of France with a cartouche of Bonifaces surrounded by oak leaves. Another vase that debuted at the 1862 exhibition was the Vase à tête de mascaron de Versailles that you see here. Let me find the mascaron ornament derived from architecture was typically in the form of a human face, rendered with frightening features to supposedly ward off evil spirits. This Majolica model was also derived from a bronze vase made for the Portier du Midi at Versailles. Known examples of this type included a vase finished with a blue ground and white decoration currently at the Grand Trianon, and a version with a tortoiseshell ground. These large-scale Majolica vessels had zinc linings for their ready use as flower vases in the imperial gardens. Other pieces in Majolica documented in the list of works sent to the 1862 exhibition included the Vase au Raisin, the Pot de Tabac Elephant, the Buire Italienne, the Medallions of the Seasons, and the Vase de Lyon, which was already shown at the 1855 exhibition. The Vase au Raisin was designed by Joseph Nicole. Pierre Demus, a sculptor of ornaments, modeled the naturalistic vine leaves and grapes set against a blue ground with the handles further wrapped in foliage and grapes. The decoration was derived from Claude Bertin's marble vases made for Versailles from 1705. The Majolica version only cost 70 francs. Another vase that debuted at the London International Exhibition was the vase agricultural designed by Joseph Nicole, of which a Majolica version was made in 1862 at a much lower cost, of which I have not been able to find an example. The list gives us clear evidence that works in Majolica were a small fraction, however, of the display. Sèvres exhibit even less of its Majolica at the Second Paris Exposition Universelle of 1867, which coincided with Baron Haussmann's renovation of the city. It was visited by approximately 15 million people on the Champ de Mars from April 1st to November 3rd, 1867, and was a celebration, as you know, of the Second French Empire. A pair of the Vase Ovale de Trianon can be found in the list of works sent to the exposition, where it was awarded a grand prize. Copied from a lead vase originally made for the amphitheater and gardens of the Grand Trianon, the design was attributed to Louis Robert, son of Robert Lorraine, dating from 1707. With its sculptural cover featuring two putti playing with a garland of flowers, a cameo and profile on the body draped with another garland and molded ram's head handles, the piece was recorded in the archive as being sold for the price of 1,050 francs. One of the pair was reproduced in the catalog authorized by the Imperial Commission. Louis II of Bavaria saw them and purchased four for what would become his Grand Palace of Linderhof. Now, other items listed in the Sèvres inventory for the exposition included the coupe à anneaux, anneaux means rings, and the groupe à la sirène. The coupe à anneaux was made in a tortoiseshell ground with ring handles as well as a blue version. It was first produced in 1855 and created by Jules Constant Pyre, chief designer. These only cost 70 francs. Two groups of the sirens were made in 1859 to 1860. Titled Couronnement de Cerise, they were made of a colored ground with a rocky base surmounted by a tortoise on which stands a siren, half bird and half woman, who lures sailors to destruction by the sweetness of her song, surrounded by a group of three angels supporting a large bowl. Leon Arnaud wrote of the superiority of the Minton Majolica, produced compared to that at Sèvres and displayed at the Paris exhibition. He'd obviously become an Englishman by now. He reported that, quote unquote, Monsieur Minton and Company, without rivals in England for the important works of Majolica, have known how to maintain their superiority in France, while they provide today with a large part of the special manufacture. We must observe that if the artistic French faience is well ornamented, it leaves much to be desired in quality. And we can cite and support only their faience of the Palissy description, that of Deck, and of the Sèvres manufacturing. But not all critics agreed. The rivalry between France and England can be found in John Webb's report on the exhibition. He was part of the team that had made suggestions for the purchase of objects from the previous international exhibitions for the South Kensington Museum. When consulted about the purchase of French Majolica, he responded positively, considering the French production to be superior to modern English Majolica. As to purchasing Sèvres Majolica specifically, he replied that Sèvres, quote unquote, was so astonished at Mr. Minton's exhibition of Majolica that they have gone on improving this as a specialty. He believed that the Sèvres Majolica was, quote, some of the most beautiful specimens in the collection, and that would be beneficial to make a purchase of any of them. It would be a novelty at all events in this country. By contrast, J.C. Robinson, the first curator of art collections at the South Kensington Museum, stated in recorded testimony that although he did find some advances in the field of French Majolica, in general, he did not find any worth purchasing at this exhibition. This is probably why the South Kensington Museum, who had purchased Majolica from Sèvres at the 3 previous exhibitions, did not purchase any Sèvres Majolica for their collection in 1867. The Majolica vases featured in the Sèvres displays, while not admired by critics and reviewers, were probably a good promotional tactic to draw attention to its Majolica atelier. Adaptations of such models from French royal palaces and gardens were high status works. Was this a rebuff to the British that Sèvres could make Majolica in large scale pieces that were even better in provenance and technique than Minton's garden vessels? Such garden pots could survive outdoors, were easily cleaned and resistant to fading, a perfect application of this new industrial product, but not without its problems in the long run. Many of the vases used in the gardens did not weather the elements well, and there are documents in the Sèvres archive detailing their repair and even replacement. Photographs of the Imperial Garden show these vases in the gardens of the Grand Trianon, the Petit Trianon, and at Versailles. A pair of vases de jardin with a blue ground can be seen on the terrace of the Petit Chateau in front of the Jardin Français. At the Grand Trianon, a series of 9 different Majolica vases are placed on the parterre of the Galerie des Cotels, including 3 vases enfants, 2 vases mascarons, 1 vase de tête satyre, and 3 vases au sphinx. At Versailles, a pair of blue Majolica vases is documented in an album from 1875. According to Napoleon III's order for garden vases, other models beyond those exhibited at international exhibitions included a vase Louis XV ancien with either a blue monochrome ground or a brown ground. This model was designed by Joseph Nicole in 1858 and sold for 70 francs. Its handles were formed of large leaves. Its center was decorated with a projecting ridge. Another work was the vase Louis XIII, with its cover made on a brown ground and goat heads in relief and floral engraved design. It was designed by Hyacinth Renier in 1859 and cost 325 francs, of which 150 francs was for painting. The engraved design was made by Octave Millet in 1866. The vase à tête de satyre was derived from bronze of similar form from 1665 made for Versailles. The vase Coupe du Cerceau was also designed with a tortoiseshell ground and a head of a satyr on each side from which the vines form handles. It was modeled in 1858 for a sale price of 150 francs. Another coupe, another coupe with the blue ground, the coupe au serpents by Nicole, had interesting snakes amongst rings as its design feature. It was priced at 70 francs. Other vase forms included a vase cachepot number 17 and another numbered 36. Both were designed with blue grounds and white decoration around 1859. The first was 60 francs and the second 70 francs. A study of the list of Sèvres glazed earthenware that was baked in the kilns reveals that most of the works were vases, horn-shaped vessels, flower pots, and groups of figures. Tableware is totally absent from the glazed earthenware production. In the years 1863 to 1866, anywhere from 5 to 137 pieces were fired per month. Sometimes only about a half to a third were delivered to the warehouse. The same set of documents also lists pieces by Marc Emmanuel Louis Solon, chemist Alphonse Louis Salvita, Leopold Jules Joseph Gély, and Joseph Ferdinand Renier. Work at the atelier was definitely a collaborative affair. These pieces ranged from a wall font by Salon to vases by Joly. Similar to Wedgwood, many pieces were derived from earlier porcelain models. For example, the two Loves Falconet, created in 1858, reused 18th century models of a smaller scale derived from Falconet's plaster model of L'Amour in 1755 and the finished marble version in 1757, while the corresponding figure representing Psyche was created especially for Sèvres by Falconet. A Majolica version was carried out with a yellow ground. A Majolica version of examples of the Enfant Timbalier and Fantassin from 1773, known as the Série des Enfants Cellières, were also realized. These were ordered by the Empress Eugénie in 1860 in terracotta. 3 vases called Cassoulette de Saint-Cloud were made in Majolica, finished in a tortoiseshell glaze in 1863. They were designed by Hyacinth Renier, decorator and modeler, in 1841, inspired by antique models of 1805 by Brongniart. This ensemble consisted of a covered oval vase accompanied by a pair of horn-shaped dolphin vessels. These Majolica models were simplified versions of the porcelain and bronze models, with the cost diminished by many thousands of francs to 350 francs for the vase, and the horns 170 francs each. Now, large-scale, highly sculptured groups of figures were a subdivision of the production. A LaRue group of 2 infants around a column wrapped with a swath of fabric was another large-scale piece made in Majolica. These 2 figures stand on a rocky, rounded base. The work is signed by the modeler Jean-Denis LaRue, who worked for Sèvres between 1851 through 1888. He was best known for his pot sur pot, which is paste on paste decoration in low relief. A set of 2 coupes supported by an infant accompanied by a swan and a second supported by a dolphin are probably modeled by the same hand a few years later. They share similar coloration modeling of figures and motif of flowing blue drapery. Other pieces that have appeared on the market give us an indication of the range of Sèvres Majolica, such as this large planter with the relief design of green leaves and cattails on a cobalt blue ground, held aloft on the backs of 3 swans with bent heads, supported by a round cobalt vase. By 1872, the manufacture of Majolica at Sèvres was discontinued, probably for financial reasons. Sèvres never moved into large-scale production of Majolica, though it had the capability of producing excellent quality Majolica. It must have been a business decision not to go down the path pursued by Minton. Also, by this time, many prominent British and French manufacturers were producing high-quality Majolica. The market was also filled by secondary firms turning out millions upon millions of medium to low-quality pieces for all sectors of the buying public. Majolica was beginning to lose its appeal and to be associated with a down-market product. Other ceramic inventions, such as pots sur pots and Celagon grounded pieces by Sèvres, were still taking the forefront of its promotion and sales. Although the workshop as a separate entity ended in 1872, later Sèvres models utilizing Majolica glazes as part of their design continued throughout the 19th century. For example, in the Museum of Art and Sciences in Australia, there is a Majolica glazed Renaissance Revival bowl. It is a small boat-shaped bowl with tall, grotesque, openwork scroll handles applied to one side. So where is the Majolica glaze, you might ask? If you look closely, the interior and exterior above the gilt center is painted in green Majolica glaze. A Joseph Chéret Puteaux with 2 Greek comedy masks was made in blue glazed faience. It was one of a series of works that Chiret designed for Sèvres around 1890 to 1900 with this fashionable blue, basically Majolica glaze. Majolica vases, however, for the imperial gardens were still being made until those are more of that glaze. And Majolica vases, however, for the imperial gardens were still being made until 1890. Documents in the Sèvres archive reveal that 20 vases were sent to decorate the gardens of the palaces of the two Trianon on the 4th of May, 1890, including 6 vases of Sphinx and 5 vases Louis XV. But the Majolica rivalry was basically over. Thank you. Yeah.
I think I know the answer maybe to this question, but it seems from your talk that a lot of the material was made for palaces or for the imperial family and maybe for exhibition. So what proportion do you think went out into the market, if any?
From what we know from the warehouse records, not very much. It was a very small part of Sèvres output, and I don't think it was extremely popular. Peter?
So did other French manufacturers try and address the bottom end of the market? I mean, or is Sèvres representative of the French response?
Sèvres was the first French response because, as I mentioned, they're already looking at what Minton has produced and trying to do it themselves in 1852. But there, in 10 years later, there was a big French ceramic industry making Majolica. There are factories like Choisy-le-Roi and Saragamine and many others. There were factories all over Europe, in fact, and there was a market for this work in so many different commercial centers that it's remarkable that it fell out of fashion so quickly and in such a devastating way. Casper?
The logistics of reproduction, how did this actually work? Were they copied off the drawings, or was there molding involved? And another quick question is the use of the term faience. Does that only apply to the French production? And does it also, is it only Majolica or also earlier porcelain?
Faience refers to earlier. There are lots of terms used to describe it, but faience is more common in French language than earthenware, which is how the Brits usually describe the ware. And what was your first question?
Logistics of reproduction.
Oh,
was there drawing?
There were drawing workshops, there were painting workshops, there were modeling departments. It was a many-stepped process. And the French were very concerned with quality and the reputation of the imperial manufactory. So a tremendous amount that was made, we can see from the kiln records, was destroyed and made again, but to be given to be sold at the manufactory. Debbie?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the French stuff is very reminiscent of Renaissance French ceramics. And is that part of?
That's part of the revival work, and Minton does that as well. There's a tremendous interest in palacy. There's a lot of palacy work that's done. There's a lot of copying of the Renaissance Majolica. But at the end, those things didn't sell well and they were very labor intensive. It's this more colorful, heavily modeled, exuberant, often whimsical work that got most of the attention and made the greatest sales.
I'm just going to encourage our online audience to send any questions using the Q&A function.
Yes.
Yes, I also have a lexicographical question. I used to work at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore,
which is our partner in the Majolica Mania exhibition.
Yes, it is a museum chock full of ceramics.
Yes.
And when I worked there, they told me that Majolica referred to the ware of the island of Majorca, which actually made earthenware in the Islamic style.
Right.
And then people in Faenza started to make this kind of ware, and so they called it the ware of Majorca. But then when the French started to get interested in this particular ware, they called it faience because they knew it as the ware of Faenza. And so I am still confused about the use of Majolica in the context of today. Is that a specific revival term or marketing term?
Majolica usually refers to the Renaissance ware. When there's a 19th century adaptation, it's then called Majolica. And everyone mixes it up. I used to mix it up too.
It's somewhat clarified now.
But to make it even more complicated, when Minton first began, they used the term palace ware to describe it. And it's only sort of 10 years later that they start using the term Majolica. So you'll find many different confusing terms to describe the same works. Andrew?
Yeah, thank you so much. To Casper's point about replicating models, I know in the potteries in Minton and other factories, a man called, I think it was Thomas Cheverton, invented a kind of three-dimensional pantograph that I think he called the reproducing machine or something like that. And he would contract out to different factories so that they could actually make quite exact copies of statues and portraits, busts, and the like. I just wonder, do you know if Sèvres had a similar?
As you know, I'm a furniture historian who traveled into ceramics. I don't really know the answer, but it would be interesting to find out.
Exactly.
Yeah, how they did it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Peter?
Just to come back to that last point, that when Minton began, they described it as palace ware. Were they doing, does that decision on their part reflect a wider sense in England at the time of identification of Renaissance ceramics with France and not Italy? Because Majolica came before.
Look, in the 19th century is the great age of historicism and eclecticism. And they confused all the terms and all the sources. And what's often fun to do is to take a piece of Majolica and see all the different crazy sources that have been lumped together. They didn't really know the historical background yet. Places like the South Kensington Museum were first being founded. And the study of these works was really in its infancy. I mean, when we look at the work coming in from Asia, and you look at the catalog entries in places like the V&A, they describe it as Indian, they describe it as Chinese, Japanese, and it's all mixed up. And most of the time, those early identifications were wrong. There was a general naivety, or as I said, it was the beginning of the study of decorative arts in its infancy. And And frankly, when we began this project, we had a great difficulty in sorting out what was what. And if you're interested in learning a little more about the terminology, I suggest you go and read Rebecca Wallace's fine essay on sources of Majolica in our catalog. And she explains it much better there, as does Claire Blakely in her chapter on Renaissance sources.
Time for one more question. We'll take one from the audience online. Phil English asks, is there a reason there seems to be more variation in colors in English Majolica as compared to Sèvres? Was it a matter of taste?
It must have been a matter of taste. And I also think when they began, they were more looking to Minton's work than they were to the colors that, George Jones used and invented, or some of the other factories. Sèvres always was known for some of its colors. And I think they stuck with the colors that they did best. And you remember I quoted a critic saying that, the Frenchmen who have gone to England for money, that terrible thing, have also lost their taste. I think the garishness and the number of different colors that you see in a Minton's or a George Jones, I think the French considered garish.
Thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you, Earl.
Okay. Our next speaker will be Jennifer Thompson. Jennifer A. Thompson serves as the Gloria and Jack Drozdick Curator of European Painting and Sculpture and Curator of the John G. Johnson Collection at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Since 2008, she has also been curator of the Rodin Museum in Philadelphia. She has curated or co-curated many notable exhibitions, including The Impressionist Eye 2019, Old Masters Now, celebrating the Johnson Collection in 2017, Discovering the Impressionist Paul Durand-Ruel and the New Painting in 2015, Van Gogh Up Close in 2012, and Late Renoir in 2010. She earned her MA and PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Please welcome Jennifer.
Well, thank you, Earl, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the Bard Graduate Center for the opportunity to join you today and to join you in person. I'd like to extend a sort of also special welcome to all of our colleagues who are joining online. Your presence is felt and appreciated in this room. So do keep those questions coming via the Q&A box. So 2 years ago at TAFAF in New York, the London dealer Stuart Lockhead had this piece tucked inside his booth. It was the 5th glazed earthenware vase of the Titans to appear on the market in recent years. And we'd long hoped to acquire an example of the vase for Philadelphia. It illuminates a really critical moment in Auguste Rodin's career when he was learning the practices of sculpture and developing his own style. It's also a highly seductive piece that raises interesting questions about collaboration and categorization. Indeed, it's been described as an ornamental ceramic, a sculptural ceramic, decorative ware, and art ceramic. This morning, I want to explore how the piece came into existence and the contributions of all those you see on the screen. Well, the vase of the Titans has been known since 1968, when a seminal article by H.W. Jansen established Rodin as the modeler of the 4 straining figures holding up the vase. It continues to surprise and is an increasingly complex story as new, previously unknown versions of the vase emerge from private collections. Let me just show you here. These are a number of the 5 known intact complete vases, and they're shown here with the dates on which they were acquired by the 5 institutions. And I'm going to start, like Susan, with a little caveat in that the last 18 months have offered us a whole series of challenges. Probably one of the more minor ones is that we haven't been able to conduct our archival research quite the fashion that we would have liked. So I offer this paper in the spirit of a work in progress and really look forward to the questions, comments, and suggestions that we'll have in the Q&A session. I'm going to begin in 1850, the moment that Miranda Goodbye so beautifully outlined for us, when the 26-year-old sculptor, Albert Carrier of Paris, he added the name Beleuse to his surname only in 1868, was invited to Staffordshire to produce Parian figures for the Minton factory and to teach modeling in nearby Handley. And as we've heard so much this morning, the French artists who were in residence in Stoke-upon-Trent in these years were really drawn and invited there to bring innovation, new design ideas, and energy to Minton's product line. Carrier Beleuse was a young, very talented sculptor at this moment who had trained as a goldsmith and had briefly attended the école. He would go on to make his name in the fields of salon sculpture, public monuments, architectural decoration, portraits, and decorative ware over the course of an incredibly prolific career. In the words of Joan Hargrove, he had a very notable dual career, both as a salon artist and as an astute designer whose commercial ventures allowed a broad public to acquire works of pleasing design. In Minton's 5 years at in Carrier Beleuse's 5 years at Minton, he produced at least a dozen designs that are very clearly attributed to him, but it's estimated that he may have worked on over 200. In this period, this is, as we've heard, Minton introduced its Majolica line, drawing on the appeal of Renaissance ceramics. And Carrier Beleuse was involved in this development. It's not entirely clear why Carrier Beleuse returned to France in 1855, but I suspect it had to do with opportunities surrounding the Exposition Universelle that year. But as has been noted, he continued to send models to Minton, to Wedgwood, to William Brownfield and Sons long after his return to Paris. And most notably, in 1862, he produced this vase with Minton for the International Exposition in London. And I have a slightly different view of Minton's display in London, showing the vase as the centerpiece. Just jump back for a moment to focus on the form that we see here, which is of 4 putti supporting a large vase. They're all positioned back to back with their arms intertwined with one another. This is sort of a remarkable piece for its sense of scale. There's a great sense of unity. So there's this very large, beautifully decorated vase with these wonderful serpents, and then the unglazed putti at the bottom. And this is a design that he would repeat again. This is one of his. I'm stepping back a little bit to show you one of his Majolica pieces that's been probably designed a little earlier in the 1850s, but this particular one is stamped 1858. But you get a sense of the kind of playfulness which is so characteristic of Carrier Beleuse's work in this period, and of the use of the sort of infant or putti, which he will bring up again. And here I'm just showing you 2 vases from the 1870s. I should apologize, I have mislabeled this slide. The vase on the left is a Sèvres piece, and the one on the right is a Minton piece, which I think my air here goes some way to suggest how much his work it almost is indistinguishable in some ways for these two firms. But I will point your attention here just to the ways that he uses these female figures and the infants to kind of hold up these two quite large vases. By 1864, Carrier-Beleuze's career and reputation were very well established. He'd recently sold a marble sculpture of a bacchante to the emperor, and he was involved in a really consistent production of ornaments and vases for various commercial houses. And this work was quite labor intensive and required a significant studio help. I'm showing you here a photograph of Carrier-Beleuze in the center with just a handful of his studio assistants in 1860. But in 64, he takes on a 25-year-old assistant named Auguste Rodin. And Rodin at that point joined a very bustling atelier in Montmartre. Rodin himself was fresh from the Petite École. He had tried 3 times to enter the École des Beaux-Arts and had failed each time. So he was really forced to kind of learn sculpture by working through others and learn it sort of firsthand rather than in an academic setting. Rodin in 1864 needed to support himself, his partner Rose Beret, and their young son. Carrier-Beleuze took on Rodin as a modeler. And I'll show you here, this is not a piece that Rodin worked on, but I show it here just as an example of the sort of work that Rodin might have done in this period for Carrier-Beleuze. He would be handed a very rough clay figure group and be asked to complete the details. So we might imagine that Rodin would have been given in clay something like the group on the left and be required to kind of complete it out so that it resembled the engraving on the right. Rodin, as he told several of his peers a couple of years later, felt very confident of his ability to do this work for Carrier-Beleuze. He boasted that while Carrier-Beleuze had good ideas of arrangement, a pretty correct eye, and composed well, he could make a sketch that no one could finish as well as myself. Carrier-Beleuze had a slightly different perspective on this relationship, exclaiming later, "Sacred name of Rodin, he has worked for me for 10 years, and I have not been able to print myself upon him. He will never be able to model as I want him to." And it's during this period, though, in Rodin's career, in which we find him, I think, in some ways, truly becoming a sculptor. He learns every facet of sculpture production and marketing while he's with Carrier-Beleuze. And I think it may be the fantasy busts and other works that he does in this period that really drove his personal determination to work from living models. And so on the weekends and in the evenings, whenever he could, Rodin was doing his own work. And it was of a very different character in some respects than the work he was doing for Carrier-Beleuze. In 1870, Carrier-Beleuze was invited to Brussels to work on the stock exchange building there, and he took Rodin with him. But within a year, the relationship between the two men had faltered. Carrier-Beleuze is alleged to have fired Rodin because Rodin was producing sculpture on the side, and he was doing so apparently using professional contacts that he'd first gained through Carrier-Beleuze's atelier. I'm slightly puzzled by this story because, as we've seen, Carrier-Beleuze was himself working in this moment for multiple different commercial houses. So I suspect he would not have been quite so disapproving of a sculptor taking on as many opportunities as possible. And I think that the falling out probably has more to do with just difference in temperament, their personal style, and the tensions between a master and an ambitious assistant. The breach was, the two went their separate ways for much of the 1870s, but the breach was not irreparable. In 1877, the two embarked on a new working relationship. And it seems to have started by Rodin pledging that he would not ridicule Carrier-Beleuze behind his back in the atelier. And this may get again to some of that relationship between the two of them, and Rodin probably being rather arrogant and difficult to work with. In 1875, Carrier-Beleuze had been named the artistic director of the French porcelain manufacturer of Sèvres. and he was charged with revitalizing the state-supported factory, whose products, while technically proficient, had become somewhat stale and lackluster. As part of the improvements, the administration was separated from the artistic direction, and Carrier-Belleuse was appointed the artistic director, I think in recognition of his earlier experience at Minton. In sort of embarking on this work at Sèvres, Rodin identified 4 sculptors who he regarded as really critical to turning and helping improve the operations, and one of them was Rodin. Of the 4 that were employed by Carrier-Belleuse at Sèvres, Rodin received the best employment terms. He received 170 franc retainer each year and was paid 3 francs an hour for his work. He was only required to come into Sèvres 2 days a week, and then he could spend the rest of the time working in his own studio. I think this demonstrates that flexible work schedules and working remotely are not unique to 2021. Rodin reportedly loved his work for Sèvres, which lasted in a part-time fashion through much of the 1890s. And it's in this period that the two embarked on their work on the vase of the Titans. And the work likely began with Carrier-Belleuse giving Rodin a drawing, much like, if not precisely along the lines of this black crayon and chalk sketch. And in it, we see a large, rounded ornamental vessel supported by seated figures. And I'll just point out to you here in this view to look and notice that you see 3 figures on this view. They seem to have somewhat extended limbs, particularly the figure on the left has these elegant pointing toes. In the 1870s, Rodin was widely regarded as an exceptional modeler of the human figure. In 1876, 77, he'd been involved in a controversy surrounding his salon submission of The Age of Bronze, which was accused by his critics of having been cast for life. So his critics were essentially saying that he hadn't modeled it, he had just taken a live model and made various molds of his body. Carrier-Belleuse was among the artists that came to Rodin's defense and in fact stated that they knew he had modeled it from life and that it was so well done that it was actually not believed to have been a work of his hands. And so it was, I think, quite appropriate that Carrier-Belleuse would at this moment turn the very specific modeling of these figures that are part of the pedestal for this phase over to Rodin. I'll just note that this drawing was part of a publication that came out in 1884 in which Carrier-Belleuse had over 200 illustrations demonstrating how the human figure could be incorporated into such designs. But Rodin, in 1877, had returned not so long ago from several weeks in Florence and Rome. It was his first trip to Italy. He visited a number of museums and churches, and it was a moment when the Italians were celebrating the 400th anniversary of Michelangelo's birth. Rodin wrote back to Paris to friends that he was disconcerted by the work of the Renaissance sculptor, but he persisted in his study of Michelangelo so that, quote, the great magician is giving up a few of his secrets to me. And I'm showing you here, obviously on the left, The Dying Slave, which was a piece that would have been known to Rodin in Paris. And then 2 of the 20 nudi, male nudes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. These are pieces that we know Rodin was paying a great deal of attention to. And indeed, he spent his time in Italy just frantically drawing. These are 2 pages from a notebook he had with him at the time. And I'll just draw your attention to the sheet on the left and that lower left corner in which we see these figures sort of seated or almost doubled up upon themselves with bent knees. So charged by Carrier-Belleuse to take that drawing and to make it into a 3-dimensional sculpture, Rodin modeled 4 Titans, Greek mythological figures who were the precursors of the Olympian gods, and he modeled them individually. You see on the left 2 terracotta sketches for these figures, which survive today at the Mary Hill Museum in South Central Washington State. And then on the right are 2 of 4 works that are cast from molds and that are today at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Both of these groups can be traced back to Rodin's studio, and they suggest that he kept copies of these pieces for himself, even after he had submitted other versions to his employer. And I'll ask you just once again to note the sort of intensely folded limbs, the arms bent over the heads, and the tense sort of feet that are drawn into the body in these figures. When they went to Carrier-Belleuse, he incorporated them into a pedestal, which uses a kind of this cloth sort of draped over the figures to unite them. And again, the plasticity of these figures, they're very attenuated, contorted, bulging muscles, as well as some of the exaggerated proportions of their hands and feet. And I'll just draw your attention to that. A couple of the feet and toes that you see right in the center of this slide, you get a very enormous sort of big, the large toe and then the next toe. This is very distinctive of Rodin. And I think also, helps us to kind of understand, even though Rodin is looking at Michelangelo here, he's putting very much his own stamp on these pieces. And we even get a sense of where Rodin will go later in his career with some of the elements that maybe don't make it sense entirely anatomically, or maybe even look a little funny if we look too much at them, such as the head on the left figure that almost looks like a head of cauliflower. So this is Rodin already showing some of his propensity for exaggerating figures, not being so perfectly lifelike, but really trying to draw as much feeling and expression from them as he can. This undated, and as far as I know, unmarked terracotta vase of the Titans now belongs to the Musée Rodin in Paris. They acquired it in 1957, but it has a strong classical flavor and an austerity with a very limited use of sort of color. There's a slight blue-green color you might make out just on the base of it. And this seems very much in keeping with the tone of Carrier-Belleuse's chalk drawing. If not entirely in the form of it. If you recall that drawing, the Titans and the large vessel on top of them sat on top of a cylindrical column, which was decorated with a frieze. That doesn't exist here, and as far as I know, was never realized by the two artists. For many years, it was assumed that the Vase of the Titans was produced for Sèvres. And I think, as Susan has just demonstrated, Sèvres was producing a great deal of gardenware slightly earlier, so it might have made sense that they had continued on with these large jardinières. And I just use this bust as an example of the work that Rodin and Carrier-Belleuse were doing for Sèvres in this moment, and a kind of tribute that Rodin makes to Carrier-Belleuse for the Salon in 1882. He makes a bust of Carrier-Belleuse that is later made into this porcelain by the Sèvres factory. But the appearance in the last 2 decades of several of the Vase of the Titans marked HB and Choisy indicates that they were in fact made by the Faience factory in Choisy-le-Roi, which is about 28 miles southeast of Sèvres. An earthenware manufactory had been founded there in 1804 in the outbuildings of a royal castle. And in its early days, the factory produced earthenware pieces with printed decoration. The arrival of Hippolyte Hautain and Louis Boulanger in 1836 saw the development of a new range of decorative earthenware. And in 1863, Hippolyte Boulanger took over the manufactory, and the factory began to produce large-scale Majolica pieces that seemed to have been intended to rival Minton. And among the products, and I use that products in quote, of the Hautain Boulanger company in this period is this piece, which was decorated by Mary Butterton, a British artist working for Doulton. She decorated an earthenware blank supplied by the French factory at Choisy around 1874 as part of Doulton's attempt to compete with English and continental ceramic factories. And with this, they were introducing a new ware that they called Lambeth faience. And in a demonstration of just how interconnected French, English, and American manufacturing and markets are at this moment, this dish, which is on a French earthenware, decorated by an Englishwoman, was exhibited at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, where it was purchased by the fledgling Philadelphia Museum of Art. And you'll see from the accession number that it's actually our 64th purchase. But taking us back to France, in 1889, Carrier-Beleuze's son became the artistic director of Hautain Boulanger, and it is likely under his auspices that the vases were produced. His father had died in 1887, and Louis Robert and his brother inherited the atelier, and presumably some of their father's designs. As June Hargrove has noted, Louis Robert was not shy about using or repurposing his father's work. And I'll just point out here that Louis Robert was a young boy of 2 years old when his father moved to Minton. And Louis Robert would later train at the École des Beaux-Arts with Alexandre Cabanel, but his father's influence and instruction prevailed over his painting career, and he would become known for his sculpture and work in the applied arts. And I'll just show you on the screen a piece by Louis Robert of his own ceramic work, which is this Sauve qui peut, or Every Man for Himself vase. And I think you'll see a kind of pattern developing here, a very large vase held up by these young fleeing figures. But the very year that Louis Robert was appointed the artistic director at Hautain Boulanger coincided with the opening of a magnificent company store in Paris, which was in the 10th arrondissement. The building actually is still there and has had multiple uses over the last century or so. It is actually this month apparently the home to a haunted house show, which I think sparks some horror in, I think, probably the hearts of a number of architectural historians and art historians. Since, as you see from the slide here, it is magnificently decorated. The facade sort of advertised the company's products, the tiles on the interior sort of welcome visitors, and then you see a glimpse of a remarkable sales room that just has a lavish display of the company's products. And their production in this years were immense. In 1885, they employed 900 workers, men, women, and children, who made roughly 30,000 objects a week. I should note that a very small percentage of these workers were actually devoted to the art ceramics, as the company also supplied tiles for the Paris Metro and tableware. So all 5 known vases of the Titans are marked Hautain Boulanger Choisi. And some, though not all, are dated. And I'll run through them, starting with the Philadelphia version, which dates to 1890. And I wonder if it was a sort of piece that was created with the intention of displaying it at that store in Paris. The earthenware pedestal, the Titans, is inscribed, and I hope you might be able to see it. The detail on the left is first inscribed with 3017, followed by a date, January 8th, 1890, and then the initials ORD. And it's this sort of 8-190 gives us that date of January 1890. The 3017 is a number we'll see appear on a couple of the other vases, which I think is probably the model number for the factory. The large vessel, maybe the vase itself, is stamped in a slightly different fashion. I know it's very faint here, but these are, rather than being handwritten, these are actually stamps. 196 CB, B, and 1515. And I'll point out that the exterior on the pedestal is signed A. Carrier-Beleuze. Rodin's name, of course, is not part of this because he was employed by Carrier-Beleuze to do the modeling. And so, as was appropriate and expected at the time, Carrier-Beleuze receives credit for this piece. And it is wonderfully decorated with details of oak leaves, acorns, number of kind of branches and twigs, and then these blue lizards. We know from an undated catalog, estimated to have been produced around 1895, that these 2 pieces had different names. This refers to the vase of the lizards and the support of the Titans. And this seems to suggest, as we see play out in the vases, that there's an opportunity for variation with the decoration and the glazes. And here I'll just once again show you the slide of the 5 vases, and then embark on our next one, which is the version in Detroit, which is the pedestal itself is marked 3017, but it does not seem to have a date on it. It's probably the closest in appearance to the Philadelphia version, having this really rich sort of blue-green glaze to the vase proper. This is a sort of a marvelous one with a sort of vibrant green, blue, and orange sort of glaze on the vessel itself, with the sort of appearing to almost kind of drip down the side of it. This version is, again, marked inside 3017 with the initials PIM, and then carries the date of July 20th, 1899. What's quite striking about this one, in addition to its colors of its glazes, are the appearance of frogs that sort of dot its surface. I particularly like the one on the left that appears as if it's going to hop into the bowl. The Petit Palais owns another undated, apparently unmarked one that has a really rich sort of aubergine colored glaze on it. And then I'll end with the latest, or thought to be the latest of this series, a marvelous vase in Madrid that has the date 1901, and starts again to depart from the others at having more geometric patterning, and even so the appearance of handles on the side, but it again has some of this foliage. And these variations in treatment perhaps justify the jumble of terms used to describe these pieces as ornamental sculptures, sculptural ceramics, decorative vases, terms that move the pieces away from their industrial production, even though each of the components were, of course, cast from molds. The variety of colored glazes and the different types of fauna would allow customers to acquire unique pieces. And they also introduce an element of eclecticism or even whimsy into the composition, in which we see these tortured figures who hold up a vessel decorated with lizards and frogs, tiny scurrying creatures known for their skittish natures and tendency towards flight. And while the vase of the Titans appears to have an equally fleeting appearance on the art market today, the reemergence of several intact vases allow us insight into 19th century taste and to appreciate the work as an ensemble, as well as the contributions and roles played by both Rodin, Carrier-Belleuse, and Louis Robert Carrier-Belleuse, and the artisans at Choisy-le-Roi. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
When I look at these pieces, I almost feel like the tops and the bottom don't go together. I mean, there are these, as you keep pointing out, there are these tortured looking men underneath who with these, you know, astonishing musculatures. And then there are these very playful animals and leaves and frogs and salamanders and so forth on the top that just, you know, I mean, I know they're frogs, but they don't really seem to have a care in the world. So the two parts just don't seem to go together very well.
No, I think that's a very good point. And I was, you know, alluding to that sort of strange questionable juxtaposition. At the end, on the page that I showed from the catalog of, and I should have mentioned that catalog it was called Faience d'Art, and it was the work of Albert and Louis Carrier-Belleuse. So it's the father and the son. And I think that sort of demonstrates, at least in the lifetime of Louis Robert, these two were seen to be together. And this is where I think more work certainly needs to be done, and that I hope to do more work in understanding, how this came about. And I strongly suspect that this is Louis Robert adding his own kind of interpretation to the vase as, maybe initially conceived by his father and assisted with Rodin. If you'll recall, the the drawing that I showed you, which is much more classical in its form, and there's on that piece, there's the pedestal and this large vessel, and underneath that is a kind of column which was decorated with a frieze. The subject of the frieze has never been identified, though Jansen suggested that maybe it was a scene of the Titans and the Olympian gods kind of battling one another, and then that would then give a little bit of context to the pedestal. But I think I suspect what we're seeing here is a composition that kind of changed over time and in the hands of Choisy-le-Roi and of Louis Robert. I hope that's as much as I can. It's still an open question mark.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, another question?
Yeah, I was thinking iconographically about this piece. I wonder if the top and the bottom can be connected by the word robur and robust, which is the characteristic of the oak. Cracus robus, robur. So the struggling man, the struggling male, and the oak tree as always associated with male prowess. It's just a kind of an alliteration, and yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. No, that hadn't occurred to me, so I appreciate that.
I just maybe would like a little more clarification of like looking at this, where do we see the hand of Carrier-Belleuse and where would we see the hand? And then like that particular relationship in terms of like how Rodin would carry out Carrier-Belleuse idea, was that common in really large sculptural studios that also perhaps did these sort of industrial, essentially ornamental work?
Sure, no, that's a great question, and it's very much related to some of the practices of 19th century sculpture. We would see that the general idea for this composition came from Carrier-Belleuse and is owned by Carrier-Belleuse as a result of the drawing that he produced and then assigned essentially to Rodin and said, execute this for me. It's something actually that Rodin would do himself quite often, that he would sort of pass work on to other assistants in his studio. Rodin would have the idea for it, and that essentially is where that element of ownership and signature comes from, is having the idea and then just asking others to execute it. It's actually something that happens with a great number of artists today, is that they may not physically manufacture their pieces, but they're assigning it to members of their studio. So I think while Rodin executes this, the idea, at least in terms of artistic ownership, really belongs to Carrier-Belleuse.
Would Carrier-Belleuse have looked at the piece that Rodin marked and like suggest or like give a check off or say, okay, maybe change this, it doesn't quite match?
I think that's very much within the realm of possibility. I know that is something Rodin did himself when he was, he would constantly kind of check in on the work of his assistants and say, make this more powerful, emphasize this element or not. And Rodin, I keep referring back to Rodin because Rodin basically learned how to be a sculptor and how to run a large atelier during the years that he worked with Carrier-Belleuse. So I think there are probably many more connections between how Rodin worked later in life with what he learned when he was with Carrier-Belleuse.
Thank you so much.
Susan.
I was wondering about the state of the Choisy-le-Roi archive.
That's a very good question. There do seem to be some pieces that have been acquired by the municipal government, which did an exhibition not too long ago of some of the material. But that's an avenue for more research and travel, I hope. Thank you.
We have a couple questions from our audience online. Carolyn Riccadelli says, thanks for your talk. How confident are you that all the bases and bases are the ones that were originally paired together? In other words, do you think that we have any mixing or matching?
I think that's a great question. And that's a question I've asked myself. If you'll note, the Philadelphia vessel had 196 on it, and I've puzzled over whether that was January 1896, which would mean it was 6 years. It was created 6 years after the pedestal. I need to learn more about how Choisy-le-Roi marked their pieces and what that might mean. There are many more of the pedestals in circulation, which is always, I wonder if that's because the vessels were perhaps more vulnerable and have been lost or broken. The two pieces do come apart quite easily. There's just, there's a hole through the center that you can bolt them together. So I think there's a great possibility for kind of mixing and matching. These, as a note of provenance, all of the pieces that have come onto the art market have come out of private collections. So it's very hard to document them and to know, where we may know where they've been through the last, 2 to 3 generations, but we can't always trace them directly from the factory to their current use.
There's another question, semi-related. Christian Gervais asked, since the later ones, the non-lifetime, I'm guessing referring to Carrier-Belleuse lifetime, the senior, seems to be responding to contemporary aesthetics in its ceramics. Do you feel this change is coming from Choisy or by the commissioners or buyers of the pieces?
That's a very good question, and I think it could be a little bit of both. I don't know how much these were bespoke pieces. It does occur to me that I think this was by changing the decoration of the vessels on the top. It was a way for Hotel Boulanger to keep sort of bringing out a new model, or to sort of keep refreshing the stock and to make it, if they all looked perhaps, like the Philadelphia or Detroit ones, after a period probably of 5 or 6 years, it might feel like it was tired and had been seen. So I think there's a sense of keeping up with taste. They certainly, as you go on, they have a more sort of Art Nouveau character as well. So I think that was a way, and I would suspect that's Choisy-le-Roi making those decisions, but I suppose it's possible that a client would go to them and say, I prefer, I see a friend of mine had, an aubergine colored one, I want one like that too, or can I suspect it was a little bit of both.
There's one more question here from Ellen Danker. Do you see any changes in the interpretation or modeling of the figures over time? Presumably they're composed from various molds by different factory modelers.
That's a great question, Ellen. I was very mindful that we in Philadelphia acquired our piece in November of 2019. And since then, I've not been able to do as much traveling to compare all the other versions. And I think that's a great question, is to see how the mold and whether there were start to see distinctions, particularly amongst this series of 5. So, more to come. I think we have one more question in the room.
Just a very quick one. When you go to the Rodin Museum today, you're being told this great story of Rodin's inspiration from antiquity and his marbles and this private collection. Was that part of his career? Did he hide this himself, or did he kind of invent a new narrative about him going back to the roots of sculpture, rather than having been, a craftsman employed in a factory?
I think the two kind of narratives of Rodin can actually coexist. He does have an astonishing collection of antiquities, which are still a part of the Musée Rodin today. The bulk of them are housed at Meudon, which was his home and studio. He would acquire those as he became, a more successful artist and had the funds to do so. I think he was always interested in the antiquities. You could see at the Louvre and elsewhere. But I suspect that as he matures and sort of develops his own sense of style and direction, that antiquity becomes an increasingly important aspect of his work, because he's constantly thinking about how to place himself within the whole sort of story of art history, and he is very deliberate in not necessarily wanting to be an art of his day. dislikes often depicting figures in contemporary clothing because he wants to kind of speak to a timelessness. And I think in that sense, he's trying to connect back to Michelangelo and connect his own work to antiquity. And so we see that as an increasing element of his work, and essentially merging 1880s, 1890s, and then his great sort of interest in antiquities and as he's acquiring them really occurs in the years around 1900. And I could have included here some of the antique vases and pieces in which he starts to create these assemblages of antiquities with his own work. And it's very much creating a dialogue. A number of them actually do have to do with these large vessels with sort of human arms and other sort of fragments of bodies coming out of them to be kind of a natural trajectory from some of these. Great, thank you.
Our next speaker will be Dr. Laura McCrulis. Laura, oh, I have my mask on. Sorry. Laura is one of my compatriots in this Majolica mania endeavor that we started about 5 years ago together with Susan. Anyway, she is the research curator at the Bard Graduate Center and again, project director for Majolica mania. She's a material culture scholar with specialization in the 19th century decorative arts and design. And her past published work is focused on the recovery of institutional histories, the nature of patronage relationships, and the narrative life cycles of objects and interiors. And that's what else.
She was a BGC graduate?
Yeah, so. And Laura, of course, is an illustrious BG double graduate, master's and PhD.
One of our PhD poster children.
Anyway, I will let Laura take it away now.
Thank you, Earl. Hello, everyone. Just going to reorganize up here a little bit. Oh, sorry. So Miranda Goodby's paper underscored the critical importance of the interchange between French artisans and English ceramic manufacturers. And the career of French-born painter Émile Aubert Lesueur illustrates this phenomenon quite clearly. Lesueur is primarily known for the ceramics he decorated while working for Josiah Wedgwood and Sons from 1860 through the mid-1870s. Indeed, the outlines of Lesueur's career have been documented and repeated with some frequency in published sources, but with limited detail. During his lifetime, Lesueur appears to have been acutely aware of the necessity of self-promotion and in particular of controlling his own narrative. Writing a brief idiosyncratic memoir entitled 5 Years in the Potteries and befriending ceramic historian and author Llewellyn Jewett, who wrote fawningly of Lesueur's work in his groundbreaking Ceramic Art in Great Britain, published in 1878 and reissued in 1883. In fact, Jewett's text appears to have been the primary source for much of Lesueur's early biographical details, including the oft-cited characterization that he was, quote, one of the first artists in England to revolutionize the decoration of pottery, end quote. The other contemporary source, which seems to offer a more balanced appraisal of Lesueur's work, is the history and description of the old French faience, written in 1903 by Minton's preeminent pot-sur-pot artist turned author, Marc-Louis Solon, who conveniently was the son-in-law of Léon Arnoux, of whom we have learned so much about this morning. Just to reiterate, he was Minton's art director and chemist responsible for the successful invention and reinterpretation of Majolica. Using these primary sources, archived correspondence between Lesueur and the Wedgwoods, and various contemporary press accounts describing his work displayed at international exhibitions, I hope to place the full scope of Lesueur's painted decoration into context, from the very grand exhibition pieces, of which there are many, to the more humble commercial objects, of which there are many, many, many more. These two images serve as representative examples of both. So Lesueur came to the medium of ceramics relatively late in his career, having initially trained as an academic painter under the relatively obscure artist Louis Hersan, and then briefly in the atelier of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. By most accounts, Lesueur was an accomplished painter working in both oils and watercolors. He excelled in landscapes and genre scenes, which in the 1830s aligned with the popular tastes of the expanding middle classes. In 1831, at the age of 26, he exhibited 8 paintings at the Paris Salon. One entitled Le Jeune Frère Malade was awarded a second-class medal and was subsequently acquired by the Musée National du Luxembourg, which must have been quite an accomplishment for the young artist at the time. This particular work shows the essence of Lesueur's style at the time, or as one critic noted, the painting, quote, features strongly marked shadows, powerful, firm, yet sober tones that render a deep, melancholy expression, end quote. Lesueur often employed this somber palette in his paintings and later in his ceramic decoration. His next significant professional milestone was the publication of the book Voyage pittoresque dans la Régence d'Alger in 1835. This was a collection of about 50 lithographed plates after sketches and watercolors that Lesueur and his collaborator, Anglo-French painter William Wilde, had made during a tour of Northern Africa in 1833. The plates show a range of street scenes, architecture, interiors, and figural compositions, illustrating the dynamic beauty of Algeria during the early years of French colonization. And here is a Lesueur watercolor with its corresponding plate from the book, and another, this one by William Wilde, in the collection of the V&A. 2 years later, Lesueur worked with Wilde on a second publication, Album Vénitien, comprised of 12 lithographed views of the city completed in 1837. By 1838, Lesueur had married Josephine Viviande and presumably was painting full-time. Although firm evidence is not available, one wonders whether he was actually able to support himself solely through his artistic pursuits. While his erstwhile friend, Mr. Jewett, dutifully wrote that Lesueur's oil and watercolor pictures were, quote, always eagerly sought for and purchased at high prices, end quote, this anecdote, surely based on Lesueur's own recollections, may not be wholly accurate, as it seems fairly unlikely that if Lesueur was experiencing financial success as a painter, that he would readily opt for a full-time career in the decoration of ceramics. Indeed, the timing of his move into the realm of the decorative arts seems to point to financial necessity. Lesueur began experimenting with ceramics during the late 1840s, which coincided with the birth of his children, Jules Frederick in 1847 and Émilie Thérèse in 1849. The associated costs with raising a young family amidst the relative political turmoil in France at the time may well have pushed Lesueur to reevaluate his income potential as an artist. The move towards ceramic decoration also coincided with 2 large public sales of Lesueur's paintings and watercolors, the first on May 8, 1849, followed by another held on February 9th, 1850. Two printed catalogs list the individual titles, about 150 works in total. And while conjecture on my part, the scope and scale of these sales have the feel of a massive clearing out of his studio. Lesueur's first known work in ceramic decoration occurred during the late 1840s, while associated with the Francois Lorrain earthenworks in Bourg-la-Reine near Paris. This plate, which illustrates the Old Testament story of Jesus at the Well of Jacob, is inspired by the Veronese print on the right. Clearly, this is Lesueur's early attempt to decorate the ware in the style of Renaissance Majolica historiato painting, a type of narrative painting on tin-glazed earthenware, often composed of historical, mythological, or religious scenes, as seen in these examples. Note Lesueur's relatively sketchy drawing technique, which will later become the defining characteristic of his style of decoration. And also note his signature conspicuously placed at the bottom center of the plate. Nearly all of Lesueur's ceramic paintings are signed as if on a canvas. Here are two additional historiati examples. The plate on the left appears to be some sort of peep show entertainment, perhaps an original composition by Lesueur, while the scene on the right is painted with a pastoral Madonna and Child scene. On both, the palette is somewhat constrained, but nonetheless evocative. And Solon, writing on Lesueur's first few years at Bourg-la-Reine, opined that by far his best work belonged to this period in his career. This last example is not typical of Lesueur's work in terms of subject matter. The Pudo riding a mythical creature or sea monster was a decorative motif recorded in all manner of Renaissance prints, as seen on the right, and could be used as a central pictorial motif or incorporated into an overall surface of fantastical grotesque ornament. Again, you get the sense of the freedom of the artist's brush, my chosen topic for this paper, a description very aptly penned by Jewett. Bourg-la-Reine was a critical period of experimentation and foundational training for Lesueur. But oddly, this formative piece of his ceramic decorating career was omitted in Jewett's biographical account, no doubt overshadowed by Lesueur's subsequent move in the spring of 1853, which was to secure a position at the French state manufactory of Sèvres. Little detail of Lesueur's tenure at Sèvres can be gleaned through the archive records. The timing of his employment corresponded to the period in which Sèvres was actively experimenting with the production of Majolica, as explored in Susan Weber's paper, but there appears to be no evidence to support that Lesueur was involved in this venture. He may have painted porcelain vases for the Paris exhibition held in 1855, but again, we have no specific documentation of this. He is simply listed as a painter of figures. This vase in the collection of the Château of Fontainebleau seems to show Lesueur's adaptation to the Sèvres house style, if you will, a more controlled, precise manner of painting than we saw employed previously. But the consistent and oft-repeated reason for his leaving Sèvres was that his technique allegedly, quote, caused a division amongst the artists, this was Jewett's version, or voiced more plainly by Solon, quote, his rough and sketchy style did not suit dainty porcelain, end quote. According to the records at Sèvres, he appears to have left the firm in about 1855 after only 2 years of employment. We encounter a brief gap in his biography here until 1858, which marked the year of his wife's death and his move from France to England. Lesueur was surely aware of the potential opportunities that awaited French artists and designers in the Staffordshire potteries, but initially sought employment in London. For 6 months, he remained, in his words, quote, unhappy, unnoticed, and unknown, until he moved north to Staffordshire and was hired by Minton in 1859. At the time, Minton and Company was indisputably the preeminent ceramics manufacturer in England. The firm continued to enjoy the financial and reputational benefits of its Majolica innovation and had attracted significant artistic talent to appropriately support this line of production. Given his training and experience and the growing community of French artisans employed by the firm, Lesueur should have been able to fit in seamlessly. His known works during the period include complex compositions in the style of Historiato Majolica, many inspired or directly copied from prints, a practice that was widespread both in the decoration of Renaissance Majolica and in Minton's finely painted Majolica-inspired wares from the 1850s and 1860s, such as this example. This monumental work replicates a portion of Raphael's Battle of the Milvian Bridge, executed in the Hall of Constantine, now part of the Vatican Museums. The plate is an extraordinary display of Lesueur's skill with this medium. This type of decorative painting demanded an unerring hand, as mistakes could not be easily corrected, given that the pigments and glaze were immediately absorbed into the porous ceramic body. And here, by contrast, is a depiction of the Holy Family within a spare landscape with a young St. John the Baptist seated on the ground to the right. This plate, or so-called palissy was inspired by French Renaissance prototypes. Lesueur was responsible for the painted decoration in the center. It is signed, and a study for the decoration appears on the right. Both pieces are currently on view in our exhibition. Now, this example is markedly different than any of the other works I've shown, and it's a bit of a precursor of the type of painted decoration that Lesueur would become known for at Wedgwood. Here, he has depicted a charming scene outside of a ceramics workshop in the Potteries. A potential customer in what appears to be aristocratic 18th century dress discusses the merits of a snake-handled vase with the shopkeeper, while the young artist, possibly responsible for its decoration, appears at the door. The snake-handled vase was indeed a form that was produced by Minton during the late 1850s, and other identifiable Minton shapes are strewn in the foreground. Lesueur's monogram appears prominently on the shop sign above the door. This composition is decidedly not Minton-like, and given its playful character, I wonder whether this particular piece was Lesueur's swan song. In his words, Lesueur described his experience working at Minton as, quote, "never a day without feeling the heavy hand of a master," end quote. His work was subject to daily inspection and critique, which he apparently found to be intolerable. And so within a year of his arrival at Minton, he left. By now, we see a pattern of behavior that Solon later attributed to Lesueur's, quote, "eccentricity and independence." But in essence, it appears that his artistic temperament, or ego, and restless character may have contributed to an unnecessary peripatetic lifestyle, i.e. his short period of employment at Bourg-la-Reine, 2 years at Sèvres, 1 year at Minton. Another ceramic historian writing at the turn of the 20th century pointed to Lesueur's difficult personality in reference to his leaving Minton specifically. Quote, "It is more likely, excuse me, that his own crotchety character had something to do with it, for he failed to work amicably with Monsieur Arnoux, who was not at all difficult to work with under ordinary conditions," end quote. Whatever the precise circumstances or motivations, Lesueur's next career move was to Wedgwood's Etruria Works, which at the time was in the process of revitalizing its internal organization and production. Established in 1759 by Josiah Wedgwood, the celebrated potter, chemist, and businessman, The firm at mid-19th century was in a precarious financial state, having relied too long on its past successes, namely ornamental jasperware, creamware, and black basalt. Modernizing the Wedgwood Company not only involved the implementation of capital improvements, but the development of new materials and techniques, as well as the employment of key personnel. Godfrey Wedgwood, great-grandson of the founder, appointed partner in 1859, was particularly focused on the firm's need to foster artistry in its production in order to boost sales. Amongst other notable hires, Godfrey was responsible for bringing Lesueur to Wedgwood in the spring of 1860. The firm had just begun making Majolica, and there was a particular urgency attended to excelling in this product line following Minton's lead. Lesueur was initially engaged on a trial basis, but after only a few months, it was clear that he offered the novelty that Wedgwood so eagerly sought. Lesueur was prolific in his production. The early pieces seemed to appeal to consumers, and so the firm initiated a contract in August 1860 that paid him a salary of £400 a year, a sum that likely made Lesueur the firm's highest paid employee at the time. Broadly speaking, Lesueur's work for Wedgwood can be grouped into two categories: copies of old masters in the style of Majolica Historiati ware, such as this depiction of a Titian altarpiece shown with a corresponding engraving, and original compositions, typically of pastoral scenes, figural groupings, and mythological tableaux. I'm showing two shell-shaped dishes with quintessential Lesueur painted figures. And here are two earthenware plaques that illustrate Lesueur's sketchy, almost impressionistic style of painting. Finely finished showpieces and objects that represented a more mass-produced commercial orientation were both critical to Wedgwood's market positioning, and the London International Exhibition of 1862 was the first major public venue within which to test the viability of the firm's Majolica and also of Lesueur's painted decoration. Wedgwood showed a variety of wares at this exhibition, relying on legacy products such as its jasperware, which was revived by the firm in the 1850s, a selection of which was illustrated in the art journal catalog on the lower half of the page on the right. But it was the group of vessels shown above that received the most attention and accolades, the Majolica painted by Emile Lesueur. This is a detail of the top image with some corresponding examples: a footed dish in the collection of Winterthur in the center, and two pairs of vases, all with a relatively subdued palette. The decoration of the vases, likely copied from old master prints, was duly described by the art journal as, quote, veritable examples of pure art, pictures painted by a true artist on the material of a potter, end quote. The catalog featured an additional full page of Lesueur's painted Majolica for Wedgwood, some of which was reproduced in this chromolithograph published in Masterpieces of Industrial Art, complete with more effusive praise for the artist. Quote, nothing could exceed the glowing brilliancy of Messrs. Wedgwood's contribution, thanks to the facile and vigorous pencil and rich coloring of Monsieur Lesueur. Indeed, Lesueur's name and descriptions of his work were repeatedly discussed throughout the popular and trade press. This type of credit given to the artist was extremely unusual at the time, for in order to strengthen the identity of the manufacturer, designers and painters were typically not identified by name. In fact, a London newspaper in 1867 noted that, quote, in England, ceramic artists are utterly unknown. They have no standing whatever before the public. Given this context, it makes the relative flurry of publicity surrounding Lesure's personal contribution to the Wedgwood display in 1862 all the more meaningful. Some of the star Lesure objects include this vase with a monochromatic depiction of a maiden in neoclassical dress in the collection of the V&A, one of a pair of vases with unusually shaped handles and elaborate painted decoration after Raphael. And this is the pair currently in the collection of the RISD Museum. The left depicts the crossing of the Red Sea after a Raphael fresco in the Vatican Loggia, and the right is painted with a version of the meeting of Leo the Great and Attila from one of the stanza of Raphael at the Vatican. These are stunning examples that represent some of Lesure's most finished and finest work. And this large dish, actually a monochromatic version of the illustrated example, is painted after Boucher's Rape of Europa. This particular example is in the collection of Cragside, a Victorian country house in Northumberland built by industrialist William Armstrong. A version of this plate we know was shown also at the Paris exhibition of 1867. And while we're speaking of Armstrong's collection at Cragside, there are two additional large Lesure decorated plates at the house, perhaps also part of a Wedgwood exhibition display, or perhaps commissioned for stock by one of the firm's high-end retailers in London, such as Thomas Good. And I've added this piece to the group. While not illustrated in the chromolithograph, it's very tempting to speculate that given the coloring and the manner of the decoration, that it too may have been part of this group of exhibition wares for 1862. In addition to the celebrated works that Lesure executed for Wedgwood, remarkably, there were also some Lesure decorated pieces displayed by Minton at the same exhibition, clearly dating from his brief period working there in 1859. Two pair of vases decorated by Lesure were listed in the Minton Archive estimate books. One of these, illustrated on the left, is painted after frescoes by the Italian Renaissance artist Domenichino. The figures include the evangelist Luke with the bull as an iconographic reference to his left. And on the other side of the vessel is a depiction of the evangelist John. The location of the second vase of this pair is currently unknown, but likely included the companion images of Matthew and Mark, also after the frescoes, executed by Domenichino and disseminated in print form as early as 1702. Mark is seen in the engraving on the right. These Lesure decorated vases were specifically remarked upon in the press as prime examples of how integral French artists were to the success of English manufacturers. In fact, 1862 was seen as somewhat of a turning point for British design and art manufacture. And Lesure certainly can be seen as having made a positive contribution to this larger effort. Without a doubt, this exhibition marked the high point of his career. Following this great critical and commercial success, Lesure was in a very strong position to request new terms of employment with the Wedgwoods. In addition to a 25% increase in salary, he struck an arrangement with the firm, which enabled him to move back to Marlotte, his home outside of Paris, for most of the year. There, he would continue to paint on decorated earthenware, which was then sent back to the Etruria factory to be fired. Lesure was in poor health and wrote of his physical suffering at length, as well as the problematic climate of North Staffordshire. His new logistical arrangements with the Wedgwoods was in part contrived to improve his failing health and therefore bolster his productivity. In 1863, shortly after this deal was struck, Lesure painted perhaps his most impressive vessels for Wedgwood, a pair of vases measuring 5 feet high, each weighing 250 pounds. The objects themselves were extraordinary feats of manufacture with detailed painted decoration after the triumphs of Alexander, a narrative series of 5 paintings by Charles Lebrun, court artist to Louis XIV. This vase in the collection of the Birmingham Museum of Art depicts Alexander the Great entering the tent of the Persian king Darius III. Lesueur has executed the image in a blue monochrome, a technique we saw employed in some of the exhibition pieces shown earlier. The pair to this vase is in the Viennese Wedgwood Museum and is decorated after Lebrun's defeat of Poros, the last painting in the Alexander series. During the next 5 years, Lesueur was prolific. A Lesueur price book lists a staggering 2,315 items completed, each with a notation of shape and a brief description of the type of decoration employed. Bathers, for example, seem to have been a genre favored by Lesueur, as there are multiple entries in the price book for Majolica plaques labeled Bathers Boucher, Bathing Diana, Bathers Surprised, and just plain Bathers. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there were nearly 300 items listed in the price book that featured Cupids. The pair on the left looked to be inspired by Boucher, and on the right, a bit of a hybrid painted with Bathers and Putti. Interestingly, this style of sketchy monochrome decoration is in fact derivative of Renaissance Majolica compendiario painting, a technique characterized by its limited palette on white ground that enabled 16th century workshops to turn out large numbers of finished pieces quickly, in a manner similar to Lesueur. Lesueur's loose and imprecise style certainly lent itself to quantity over quality. Even Godfrey Wedgwood found the need to address the unevenness of his output. Quote, "Mr. Lesueur's work does not claim to compete with the finer specimens of Majolica. When you say more attention to detail is required, you must consider the price. Mr. Lesueur is able to do the most careful paintings, as some specimens show, but the greater part have to be done at a price that will command customers," end quote. And so Lesueur's value to Wedgwood was essentially twofold, and perhaps unusual in the potteries at the time. He was skilled enough to supply the very high-end painted decoration that attracted the attention of the press and the public and contributed to the prestige of the Wedgwood brand, while at the same time, he readily produced painted wares for the masses, described by the Staffordshire Advertiser as objects, quote, "marked by dash and disregard for finical niceties." There was only one problem with this commercial strategy. It was subject to the vagaries of taste. And by the time of the Paris exhibition of 1867, Lesueur's star had dimmed considerably. And Wedgwood was sitting on a huge stock of unsold Majolica painted by Lesueur. The firm used the exhibition to try to sell the bulk of its inventory, and the Staffordshire Press took note, quote, "Judging from the large number of pieces which have been prepared for the exhibition, Messrs. Wedgwood attach considerable importance to the works of Monsieur Lesueur." Unlike the 1862 exhibition, the art journal catalog noted the works, but lavished no praise on Lesueur, and instead it focused on Wedgwood's jasperware, which had gained an enthusiastic following amongst cabinet makers as decorative ornament in furniture and in interior architectural features, such as the fireplace surround on the right. After the run of the Paris exhibition, Lesueur and Wedgwood drew up a new agreement that better reflected the current demand for his work. His salary was completely eliminated, and both parties agreed to share costs and profits. One can probably deduce that at this stage, the Wedgwoods were no longer deriving any financial benefit from the relationship, but nonetheless were reluctant to end the association outright. At the London International Exhibition of 1871, Lesueur's work once again received moderate attention from the press, particularly when his painted decoration was paired with shapes designed by French émigré Hugh Prota, who served as chief modeler at Minton prior to working for Wedgwood. Prota was also responsible for the design of the exquisite Majolica clock on the right of the illustration, an example of which can be seen in our exhibition. In the case of this jardinière, also on view in our gallery, Lesueur's contribution is relatively minor, his painting confined only to the small medallions on either side of the vessel. And here is a lovely working drawing from the Wedgwood archive showing the proposed scheme for the decoration. Lesueur also painted the figural composition on the illustrated ewer, the jardinière on the right, as well as a few other pieces that were noted in the art journal catalog. By the 1870s, there is little correspondence between the Wedgwoods and Lesueur and scant documentation of his activities. He did continue to send casks of painted ware from his home in Marlat to Etruria until weeks before his death on January 26, 1876. The following April, an exhibition of his work organized by the Wedgwoods and held at the showroom of Mortlock Limited, a London ceramic and glass retailer, was widely publicized in the press. The 270 works on view were described by a contemporary critic as consisting, quote, of plaques painted as pictures, cups and saucers, tankards, trays, and vases. The painting was free and artistic. The subjects, for the most part, original, but there was nothing very beautiful or impressive. Writing of Lesueur's work, Solon noted that, quote, no particular object could be singled out from his countless productions as a true model of ceramic art, emphasizing his preoccupation for rapidity of execution and cheapness of cost. So the question remains, did Lesueur truly revolutionize the decoration of pottery, as Jewett claimed, or was his sketchy style more a product of commercial necessity than a conscious expression of creativity? Leon Arnoux, certainly familiar with the often competing priorities of business and art, offered this perspective. Quote, if Lesueur repeats himself or sometimes gives a look a little slovenly, we must not forget that in manufactures, we have to bow to the demands of commerce and are not obliged to make everything a work of art. At its core, Lesueur's painted decoration held broad appeal for the growing middle-class market. And although the popularity of his work was relatively short-lived, he and Majolica were in fact critical to Wedgwood's 19th century revival, revolutionary or not. Thank you. Yes, Susan?
Am I right in remembering that Lesueur at one of the French exhibitions had his own stand?
He applied for his own stand and was rejected. Was it for 67? I think it was for 67. And so all of his works ended up on the Wedgwood stand. He also exhibited works in 72 with Wedgwood and Mortlock. Yes.
Thank you, Laura. That was just fascinating story and beautifully presented.
Thanks,
and
Jen.
I'm really, really interested on what you said. Something that I feel like should have occurred to me at some point. That, of course, the pigments when you're painting on earthenware are going to be absorbed into the ceramic body, and so I think as opposed to porcelain, where you've got a glassy surface that you're painting on. So I think an interesting area of future research would be to see if they experimented with any colorless underglazes so that you could paint more easily on the earthenware.
He was active, half an hour short. So he was actively involved in the technical aspects of painting, Renaissance Majolica inspired wares at Wedgwood, and was really trying to find what the optimal glaze was to put as a ground surface. But he was using Renaissance Majolica as, obviously, the point of departure from which he wanted to land. But all of the correspondence and the archive records show that these technical experiments weren't that successful. So, and again, I, like Susan, am a furniture historian pretending to be a ceramics historian. So technically speaking, I don't know a whole lot about how that works, but yes, Earl.
So I like some of those early Lorraine pieces. Is there much in existence, and where might it be if it does exist? As far as you know?
I had some trouble finding pieces that I could attribute or strongly attribute to Lesueur without physically seeing them. And so the piece, for example, that I used as my title page, that was attributed to Minton, but I don't think it was Minton. I think it was probably a Laurent piece, but again, since I hadn't seen it, I couldn't really say. The V&A has a few. I found those blue plates were in the commercial market, but they had a mark. So yeah, more research needs to be done. Yes, Susan.
How did you find the Lesueur pieces at Craigside?
Google.
Because I didn't know they had them.
I know, and we were promised better images. The pieces are fully round. One looks kind of oblong, but they're round plaques, and they are mounted in a wooden frame. So I'm pretty sure they were exhibition pieces.
Very cool.
He?
I have kind of a combined two question. Was he able to choose the prints that he was reproducing from, or were they suggested to him? And the second was he actually doing all of the painting, or was it a more standard studio practice when he was producing so much work?
Good question. He fancied himself as the Wedgwood artistic director in the mid 1860s, which I'm not sure how that works because he was literally never there. But so I would think that he had some leeway as to what prints he was working from. But having said that, we know that there were painters that worked under him. Henry Brownsword, for example, was the person that we know most worked with him and actually traveled from Staffordshire to France to help him with his work when he was working off-site. So in terms of process, the prints were usually transferred to the surface by lower level painters, and then Lesueur came in and colored them. That's my understanding. Yes, Earl.
We have a couple of questions from our online audience. Anne Anderson notes that the plaques at Craigside are in the dining room. And she also said Mortlock's was very important in the China painting craze in the 1870s, supplying materials and blanks. So was it the style he adopted that became outdated? I guess the China painting style that she's implying is different.
Well, it's interesting because, Lesueur's quality was very uneven. And there are letters in the Wedgwood archive that state, Godfrey Wedgwood writing to him and saying, look, you got to really work on your colors here because we can't sell the stuff that, is like muddy and, or, please, be mindful of the fact that we have a stock of inventory and we're not going to be able to sell it unless you give us X, Y, and Z. So, there was I think there was definitely a change of taste. I think that his quality was very uneven, but having said that, when Mortlock put on this grand display, which was essentially all of Wedgwood's inventory, or not all, but a chunk of Wedgwood's inventory that they really wanted to get rid of. And by the way, when Lesueur died, there were all sorts of obituaries in the time, you know, just sort of praising his work. And so it got a lot of attention. And from what I read, the sale did quite well. So maybe there was some nostalgia attended to that. I don't know. I don't think I answered that question, but.
Another question, this one from Neil Hyman. Did you say there's no documentation of the vases painted by Lesueur for the 1855 exposition? I assume the Sèvres vases he's referring to. Is it possible that the Fontainebleau vase shown might be the one of them?
It certainly is possible. Given COVID, I was not able to go to the Sèvres archive. I was assisted by the Sèvres archivist a couple of weeks ago, and she did find a few sheets of, they weren't the feuilles d'appréciation, but they were other records showing what Lesueur had worked on, and they were all vases. And there was one in particular, and in his biography, and I know this is like sort of whisper down the lane, initiating with Lesueur and going from Jewett, and then people just repeat it. So he apparently painted a vase that was purchased for some astronomical amount by the Emperor of Russia. And there was a vase in the records that were sent to me recently that showed, I guess it was 1,000 francs or something, but there was no evidence or documentation of exactly who bought it, and it was dated 1853, and there was just not enough information or time for me to pursue it further. But yes, he could have painted things for 55. But I'm wondering, and I don't know this, I'm assuming not, whether he was able to sign his porcelain works as he was able to sign his earthenware.
I'm going to ask the last question we have from online and segue, I think, to our next speaker with it. So Wendy Walker says, wasn't he painting on a white tin glaze? And I don't think we.
Well, I don't know specifically, but I mean, white tin glazed earthenware is by definition Majolica, a Renaissance product. But what he what he is doing, to my knowledge, is he's painting enamels over the glaze. But I'm going to let Jen Mass take that up with you because she's the scientist. Thank you.
And as we already have said, Dr. Jennifer Mass is our final speaker of this morning and going into afternoon now, at least in New York. Dr. Mass is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Cultural Heritage Science at the Barr Graduate Center. And she also leads the Scientific Vetting Committee at TEFAF, New York, and is the president and founder of Scientific Analysis of Fine Art, LLC. She serves on the advisory board of the Center for Art Law and lectures on cultural heritage science and the law at Columbia Law School, as well as other law programs throughout the United States. She's the former director of the Scientific Research and Analysis Laboratory at Webster Museum, professor of conservation science at the University of Delaware, and art conservation at SUNY College at Buffalo. Oh, sorry, that's wrong. She earned her PhD in inorganic chemistry and materials engineering from Cornell, and postdoctoral work was done at the Sherman Fairchild Center at the Metropolitan Museum. And I'll just welcome Jen to the podium. Sorry about flubbing that.
Thank you so much, Earl, for the lovely introduction. And thank you to the entire audience for making it through to the last presentation of the day, especially when I'm going to be talking quite a bit about the chemistry behind the magnificent Majolica glazes. This slide design was actually picked out by PowerPoint. There aren't going to be any equations in my presentation, and my class is online and you will not be quizzed on this. Okay, so I wanted to give an overview of what I'm going to be speaking about this afternoon, starting first with the people that were so critical to this process. And so this image here is showing Satoko Tanimoto and Sunkai Po, who collected almost all of the data that I'm going to be speaking about today. And Satoko was critical to the basically the organizing of all of the data for this project. I also want to thank Susan Weber for coming up with the idea of exploring Majolica from the scientific perspective and giving me access to all kinds of wonderful study materials, and Earl and Martin and Earl and Laura and Caroline and Alex for all of their help in this project. So what is Majolica without color? This is really so much of what is so important about this art. And so that was very much going to be the scientific focus of what we did, which is not to say that there isn't a tremendous amount of information that we could obtain by understanding the earthenware bodies in terms of the different additives that were used in the earthenwares and the type of provenance that research that you can do on clays. Although when it comes to provenance with clay for materials coming from Stoke-on-Trent, we have a fairly good idea of what that provenance is. But for this presentation, we'll focus on color. Our initial objectives for the study were to scientifically identify the Majolica glaze chemistries and compare them to the period recipe books, because oftentimes what scientists and craftsmen write down is not equivalent to what they actually do. And we see a little bit of that here. And then another important question was glaze chemistry differences between the various English factories and between the English and the American factories. But since we're focusing on the French influence today, I really wanted to look at the technology transfer between the French and English makers. The process that we used to study the Majolica glaze was X-ray fluorescence, and I'm showing a portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometer right here. And it's got some advantages and disadvantages versus the laboratory-based spectrometers, but it is wonderful in the sense that it is portable, and also that you don't have to take a sample, you don't even have to touch the object. The spectrometer is a couple of millimeters away from the object, and you get wonderful kind of elemental fingerprints for all of the glazes. Oh, and also this is a look at the data that we collect on the laptop. And so it's the positions of the peaks on the horizontal axis that tell us the characteristic X-ray energies from the various elements that are used by the potters. Okay, so I mentioned advantages and limitations. What we don't get from this technique is microstructural data. We can't look at the layer structure of all of the materials that have been applied to the surface of the object, something that's been done very extensively for Renaissance Majolica, and I'll talk about why that's the case. And also we don't get molecular data. And so when we see tin and lead together in a glaze, we can't tell whether we're looking at tin oxide or whether we're looking at lead tin yellow if the glaze happens to be yellow. And so you need a molecular analysis technique like Raman spectroscopy. And sometimes this can be done non-destructively on ceramics as well. My colleague Francesca Casadillo at the Art Institute has done some interesting work with that technique. One thing that I wanted to mention here is that we rely very heavily on this periodic table that has the characteristic X-ray energies for all of the elements that you see being used in porcelain glazes and enamels. Or sorry, I spent so much time working on porcelain, Majolica glazes and enamels. Okay, I'm not expecting you to actually be able to read this table here. I just wanted to take you a little bit through the process that Satoko and I did, basically tabulating all of the elemental data by factory, by the date of the wear, by the color of the glaze that we were analyzing, and by the elements that we identified, and everything that we've highlighted in yellow. This is a bit of our thought process in terms of thinking, these are the elements that seem to be responsible for the colors that we're seeing in this glaze. Then you have to figure out what that all means. And this usually happens sometime between 11 p.m. and 2 in the morning in the case of my team. And so we wind up with a board that looks something like this. This is Carrie's board from Homeland. And we like to think that we're geniuses like Carrie in Homeland, but sometimes I think we're more like this guy. And I feel very grateful to have so many wonderful colleagues in chemistry, in conservation, and in the curatorial practice that I can email late at night and say, what do you think about this theory? What do you think about that theory as we're going through our data? So in order to summarize our discoveries, and I really am going to focus in this presentation on technology transfer between the French and the English makers, but I did want to mention that in terms of comparing the Majolica glaze chemistries that we measure versus what the factories are publishing, there are some practices that are missing. What's particularly kind of vexing to us is the way that the greens are almost entirely copper-based greens with just like this tiny trace amount of chromium, and understanding why that decision was made. And that's probably a presentation for another time. We found that the glaze chemistry differences between the English factories were really vanishingly small, and likewise between the English and the American factories, but that the technology transfer between the French and the English makers was a fascinating area to focus on. And so we have this wonderful piece of French Majolica here, and how much influence is happening on terms of the pigments and glazes. So there's been a lot of very understandable technological and terminology confusion in this field, and I almost hate to really wade into that terminology discussion. But I want to mention that in the case of the Renaissance, such as the piece that I'm showing here, we refer to it as Majolica. And when we're talking about the Victorian material, as Susan mentioned earlier, that is the Majolica that we're referring to, even though you can see that some of the early Majolica was very much made in the Renaissance design. And so what I want to look at really is what technologies are used in both wares, and how do they actually relate to each other? Okay, so looking back at the Renaissance material, at the Majolica, and how we can understand it from a microstructural and a chemical perspective. This is essentially a cartoon of a cross-section of the ware. And so we have an earthenware body, and then a lead-rich glaze on top that's been opacified by tin oxide. And this has been one of the nomenclature debates. We say tin glaze for short typically, but in fact, just like if you were to look at the ceramics coming out of Strasbourg, we always have what's really a lead-rich glaze that is opacified by the tin oxide. And then in the case of the Renaissance materials, we have silver or copper nanoparticles that are responsible for the magnificent luster that you see on the surfaces of these ceramics. And this is what this middle layer here, the glaze, looks like under the electron microscope. So the scale bar here is 100 microns, so about the width of a single piece of my hair. So to give you a sense of the length scale that we're working at here. And all of the bright particles that we're looking at are the tin oxides in the lead-rich glaze. So they're not dissolved in the glaze, they're dispersed in the glaze. And this is the type of wonderful thing that you can do with the electron microscope, but you have to have a tiny sample in order to put in the electron microscope. And so I would like to make an appeal to everyone who is online and in the room to bring me your pieces of broken Majolica so that I have the opportunity to get some of these types of samples that I can put in the electron microscope. And then there's been tremendous amount of research and literature on the copper and silver nanoparticles that are used to create the metallic iridescence that we see on the Renaissance wares. And there's a very simple reason for that. The EU created a tremendous pot of funding for nanomaterials research. And so if you were in cultural heritage and looking to access that funding, you could study the luster, all different types of lusterwares. And so we are the beneficiaries of all of this research. And you can see the layers of tiny metal particles or metal prills on the nanoscale level that are responsible for the beautiful iridescence in the Renaissance wares. And of course, you would do reduction firing in order to get the reduction of the metallic salts to the metallic state. And again, we're looking at electron microscopy images here in order to see those nanoscale particles. The prevailing thought on technology transfer between the French and the English really has to do with Renaissance Majolica, as we've mentioned, as being the design information, but then the phenomenal French colorant technologies that were available at Sèvres in the 19th century, migrating to Stoke-on-Trent. And so you combine this design inspiration with this technology, and you wind up with this. And it makes a lot of visual sense, and it's not entirely wrong. It's just a little more complicated than this story would make it seem. And many people before me this morning have mentioned Arnaud coming from France to Minton and being so celebrated for the technological or the technology that he brought to Minton, especially in terms of the Sèvres palette. And so in some of the period discussions of his work, he's called the wizard whose magic wand and mastermind serves Minton Co so well. So I want to point out that he arrives in England in 1848. That date is going to be very important in terms of understanding how the technology transfer happens. The Majolica colored glazes were a tremendous success, both for Minton and Arnaud. And it's been said that Arnaud really encouraged other chemists in the local potteries, as well as artists, to familiarize themselves with the continental techniques. But the full story of technology transfer from the French is actually a little bit less straightforward. It turned out that what happened at Sèvres is that the French chromium-based earthenware pellet is actually created by reverse engineering an English chrome pink. And this English chrome pink is published by the French. They're very proud of having figured out how the English are making this underglazed earthenware pink. And that happens prior to the publication in 1836. So we have the technology going from Stoke to Sèvres, and it's not until Arnaud goes back in 1848 that we have all of the innovations at Sèvres coming back to Stoke. So the real story of the technology transfer then is an English innovation and some industrial espionage on the part of the French that initiates this intense research and really flourishing of creativity in refractory pigment innovation in Sèvres. And I'll show the sheer magnitude of this creative invention that goes on with the element chromium into the middle of the 20th century. It's really quite remarkable. And this is a view inside the laboratories at Sèvres today. And so this type of innovation still very much goes on there. if we look at the Sèvres 19th century palette, we can see the magnificent turquoise and the rose and the violet colors that are so commonly associated with the Majolica that's coming from Stoke-on-Trent. And this is what I'm referring to when I talk about the French refractory palette, refractory just meaning stable chemically at high temperatures. But did they all originate at Sèvres? And I can never resist the opportunity to look at palette plates. And I love how you can see these palette plates from Sèvres relate to this palette plate from Stoke-on-Trent, and how you can see that some of the most important colors used on Majolica at Stoke, the turquoise and the pink and the lavender, are all also found in the plates at Sèvres. So in order to understand how this happens, I have a timeline here that can walk us through the process of the discoveries and the technology transfer between England and France. I think a lot of us in this audience are probably already aware of 1797, the date that Vauquelin isolates chromium from a Siberian mineral source, lead chromate. And Vauquelin at this point also identifies chromium as the colorant in rubies and emeralds and spinels. And it turns out that this gemstone spinel is going to become an incredibly important technology for the huge range of colors that are produced in the 19th century at Sèvres. And what's amazing to me is that Vauquelin has the foresight to note that these are going to be very important materials in the enameler's art. And so he has some sense that they are refractory. They are going to survive at high temperatures. And then someone else whose name has come up today is the Sèvres chemist Alexandre Brongniart. And in 1802, he first starts experimenting with the chromium-based glazes at Sèvres. That's probably also a date a lot of people in the audience are familiar with. And by 1804, that's when Brongniart starts to use chromium to produce green enamels and glazes. But he's using just one form of chromium, this chromium oxide that I'm showing here, mixed with a lead flux. And by 1806, that's when the Sèvres chromium grain glazes enter production. So the innovation continues into the 1830s, and this date should actually be 1836, when Brongniart has a colleague acquire and reverse engineer a chromium-based English pink that's made for underglaze and earthenware. And then in 1847, we have Jacques-Joseph Ibelman, who is succeeding Brongniart. And it's really Ibelman who invents all of these new spinels and garnets that become really the foundation for the palette in the 19th century at Sèvres. And so spinels and garnets, we like to think of them, I like to think of them as beautiful jewels, but in fact, they're also used as pigments. Spinels are thought of as the great pretender because they can imitate with their variety of colors so many other gemstones. And it took a long time for gemologists to understand the difference between spinels and rubies. And so in the imperial state crown of England, what was long thought to be a ruby is in fact a spinel. And then garnets like spinel come in an entire rainbow of colors. And some of you might be familiar with the fashion in the 19th century of using the demantoid green garnet rather than the deep red garnet that we're typically more familiar with today. And this is a statistic that really just kind of blows my mind, that ultimately 76 of the 138 pigments that are used in the Sèvres palette in the 19th century are based on chromium, on one element. So really just a remarkable chemical achievement. And it turns out the spinels and the garnets are only 2 of 5 important groups of chromium-based pigments that were used at Sèvres. And I'm showing the general formula for a spinel here. It's a mixed metal oxide. And depending upon the small amount of transition metal element like chromium that is doped with, you can see that you can get just about every color in the rainbow as a spinel, and you can imitate sapphire, you can imitate pink or yellow sapphire or diamond, and you can imitate rubies, as I mentioned earlier, even garnets. And then I love this diagram here that shows the chemical transition between all of the different colors of garnets, many of which we see being used in the Sèvres palette. And so it's not just the almondine red garnet that we're so familiar with in Victorian jewelry, and also this green garnet up here, uvarovite, but also spessartine, this beautiful orange garnet that you see being used in the 19th century in jewelry as well. And this is the generic chemical formula for garnets. It's a type of silicate known as nesosilicate that is really based on, I would say, isolated silica tetrahedra. And so that's why we have the tetrahedra in this diagram here. It's kind of a call out to the crystal structure of the mineral. So it's easiest to think about all of these 76 chromium-based pigments at Sèvres by dividing them into their 5 categories. Category 1 is the simplest pigment. Escoleite is the mineral name, and it's the chromium oxide that gives this wonderful forest green color. And then the garnet that I pointed out on the last slide is known as Victorian green or uvarovite garnet, and that is what occurs in this range right here on this diagram. And so that's also going to give you a shade of green that's slightly paler than the chrome oxide. If we look at the continuous series between chrome oxide and alumina, where you have continuous substitution of chromium for aluminum on the crystal lattice, then you can get a wonderful range of pigments going from green all the way to pink. And so that's our 3rd category. And Sèvres had 12 pigments that fell within this range. What's going to be really important in terms of the relationship between the French and the English and technology transfer is this next series that's shown in pink. And this is the cassiterite to the mayolite series. And I'll show that in more detail on the next slide, but it's called chrome tin pink because you have a tiny amount of chromium in calcium tin silicate. But then the spinels are really quite remarkable. Just about 60% of the chromium-based pigments at Sèvres are actually spinels. And this diagram here shows the range of colors that they come in. And so it's really quite remarkable. And so I think we do Sèvres a disservice when we're doing analysis only by X-ray fluorescence and saying, oh, we see chromium, and then we kind of stop there because often we're concerned with 18th century versus 19th century manufacturer. And we're really ignoring the tremendous chemical and technological innovation that was taking place at Sèvres. Okay, so I want to focus on this pink area of the diagram in here, where we have a continuous, basically, substitution between basically chromium doped tin oxide or cassiterite and this chrome tin pink, which is known as mayolite. And it's interesting in the Sèvres literature, this is called Sèvres pink, or it's sometimes spelled with a CK. And so it's got an English name rather than a French name, even though it's called Sèvres pink. And so, as I mentioned, this is something that was adopted from British pink pigment that was used for underglazes on earthenware. And it turns out that Brongniart has a colleague who is largely lost to history named Malagouti, who actually is the chemist who reversed engineers this material in, and again, this is 1836, and even complains that the English are adding decoy elements in order to prevent the French from understanding their technological secrets. So he publishes this for the French world in, or the French scientific world in 1836. And I love the title of his article because he starts with on the pink color made by the English. and on an extraordinary coloration of stannic acid by chrome oxide. So he's not trying to hide the fact that this was stolen from the English at all. He's bragging about his chemical prowess, his ability to take this English technology and figure out how it works. And it's not really intuitive because you're going from this wonderful green chromium oxide and transforming it into this beautiful range of colors from pale pinks to burgundy reds. And this is a look at some of the results of the analysis that he shows here. Okay, so this whole concept of stealing trade secrets and then blaming the victim is so integral to the history of ceramics that I thought this was a great additional example, because so much of the way, for example, hard paste porcelain technology travels is that you have the Vezzi ceramic porcelain factory actually doing industrial espionage in Dupaquier and Meissen, and then therefore winding up with the ability to make hard paste porcelain. And so fascinatingly, Malaguti continues in his article that he had to get rid of any materials that might not have been essential. And he says that this is because commercial products are always going to be unclean, either because of the raw materials, but then he goes on to say, or because of the somewhat forgivable cunning of the manufacturers who mix impurities on purpose to confuse the curious who would like to uncover their secrets by analysis. And I think has been alluded to many times today how much money was at stake here in terms of the financial success of Minton, for example. And so there were a lot of reasons for keeping all this information secret. So the rose pink is actually the English pink that is uncovered at Sèvres, and he talks about a rose material, colored material made in England, used as an earthenware underglaze, and after firing gives a blood red color of admirable effect. And then he goes on to just talk a little bit about how great this pigment is, that it's insoluble, it's refractory, it's going to behave well at high temperatures. And I'm showing these images here of early figures made by Ralph Wood and Son. And I'm not saying here that these are chrome pinks because they haven't been analyzed. And so we don't know yet. And so it's kind of tantalizing to look at these burgundy colors and these pink colors that I think we all have originally assumed that they're made from colloidal gold. But in fact, it's interesting to think about when this chrome pink might have been made in Stoke and by whom. So then I went into the literature to figure out who had done scientific study of Staffordshire figures that could help us to answer this question. And it turned out that Lauren Fair at Winterthur and I may seem to be the only people that have done this type of scientific study. And I think there's a tendency to focus on the masterpieces, but the day-to-day wear have important innovations in them as well that we really can't afford to overlook if we're going to understand the development of these new technologies. And so I'm starting to wonder if we might actually have seen chrome pink in this snuff taker from Staffordshire that dates from 1820 to 1830, because we were making ourselves crazy looking at that pink color in his breeches. And we found tin, but no evidence of the gold that would indicate the colloidal gold that we would expect. But unfortunately, the gold was below our minimum detection limit of the technique that we were using. And the chromium that would be in chrome pink was below our minimum detection limit as well. And so I want to go back to this figure. This is still an open question in terms of a chrome tin pink versus what we think of as more of a colloidal gold, purple of Cassius, Butker luster type pink. So when was chrome tin pink actually invented and implemented at Staffordshire? I think it was sometime between these early wood figures, these pearlware decorated figures in 1800, and the Prattware that tends to be more popular in the 1840s. And so again, we ignore these sort of items for the masses at our peril if we're going to understand really the technological innovation that's taking place at the factories. This does not look to me like a colloidal gold pink. It looks like a chrome tin pink, but of course I haven't analyzed it. And so I'm looking forward to the opportunity to looking at some more of these pieces. But if we go back to Thomas Laken's enamel recipes, which he published in, or which he wrote in 1824, they weren't published until a couple of years later. It's interesting that Laken is actually already providing chromium-based enamel formulas for greens and blacks as well as reds. And so he speaks to a carnelian red that's made with chromate of iron. And so we do have reds that are being made with chromium as early as the 1820s. And what's also fascinating about the Laken, or the writings of Thomas Laken, is that he gives recipes for colloidal gold pink and for a chromium-based red, both used at Stoke at the same time by 1824. And this may well be what we're looking at here potentially is a financial decision in terms of the expense of using gold versus how available chromium was at this time. I also wanted to point out, I thought this was interesting, carnelian red, and I know that Pat Halfpenny has recently talked about the use of the terminologies of red and pink during this period. But when we think about using a chrome tin pink, what I wanted to show here was a recent study actually in a scientific journal. This is in the American Ceramic Society Bulletin. And what they're calling a frit, I would really call a flux. And so that's what we're looking at down the side. And then across the top is the different firing temperatures. And you can see how exquisitely sensitive chrome tin pink is to the flux that's being used and the temperature that it's being fired to. And so you can get this entire range of colors going through burgundies, pinks, lilacs, and corals, and that it certainly is possible to get a carnelian type color using chrome tin pink. Although when I looked up the flux that Laken refers to, it doesn't have tin in it. So I don't think that this is a chrome tin pink recipe. When we move forward in time, then we have a lot more documentation in terms of what was being done for the different Majolica color and recipes. And I'm showing here recipes from Stoke-on-Trent in 1884. And I wanted to point out that this maroon pink that he gives the recipe for, you can see the use of tin and potassium bichromate, which is one of the techniques that was used ultimately at Sèvres. Here's the potassium dichromate in the French recipe. And then in this 1873 book on pink Majolica glazes, we see the use of tin oxide, whiting, which is just calcium carbonate, and green chrome. And so we see the use of the second French recipe as well. So the French, after they do the reverse engineering, they managed to go on and then create the same two recipes that the English were using, which I thought was interesting. And then Arnaud's recipe book from Minton Archives, which is just a phenomenal resource to the extent that I could read his handwriting, which was not always. And so I did find one instance in his notebook, which is fabulously organized and the way I would like every lab notebook to be written, where he is combining stannous acid with chromium in order to create a rose color. I also wanted to note that chrome tin pinks continue after Majolica, and I'm doing a lot of research on the Fulper pottery in works in Trenton and their famous Famille Rose that they really try to link back to the colloidal gold technology, in fact, is actually made from chrome tin pink. And then Philippe Colombon, one of my colleagues in Paris, is still doing a tremendous amount of research on the whole variety of chrome tin pinks that were used at Sèvres. So in conclusion, the full story of Stoke's Majolica palette begins actually with chromium experiments at Stoke and not chromium experiments in France. And the French don't even invent Sèvres pink. Instead, they reverse engineer an English sample. But then they take the ball and they run with it. And they come up with this magnificent 76 chromium-based pigments that becomes the foundation of their palette in the 19th century. And I would be remiss to not mention all of the questions that still need to be addressed here. I've really barely scratched the surface. We still don't know the exact date of chrome tin pink development at Stoke and who was responsible for that. The luster technologies I'm fascinated with, because bismuth and tin start to be used in luster technologies in the end of the 19th century. What I mentioned about the greens and the strange role of chromium and copper, or ratio of chromium and copper in the greens, the molecular and microstructural analysis of Majolica glazes that we would love to do to understand the dispersed versus dissolved colorants. Thank you so much for your attention and for having me here this morning, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes.
I have a general question, and this may not apply here, but what is the composition of the pink lusterwares that the British were producing early in the 19th century? How and why is it different than the flag colors that are not metallic?
That's a great question, and something my friend Ron Fuchs and I were going over recently in terms of trying to understand how the early 19th century pink lusterware relates to what's happening later in Majolica. And what we were finding in the literature is that that still is a gold-based pink for those early 19th century lusterwares that are so popular. But I think, to be continued, there's a lot more to learn there.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have at least a couple from our audience. Elena Grant wanted to note that the Potemkin service, which was featured in your slide about the 19th century palette of Sèvres, was actually made in 1770. So she was wondering whether this was a later copy of the Russian.
That was my scientific interpretation of the long 19th century.
And Carolyn Riccadelli, thank you so much for this incredible research and explanation, Jennifer. I have so many questions, but I'll throw this one out for now. What do you know about the geological source of chromium at this time? Were there multiple locations or one main source?
Fabulous question, Carolyn, and I could give a whole other presentation on that. I mean, we see originally that chromium ore is identified in Siberia, and I don't know exactly how long it took for that source to be mined out, but there is an incredible amount of chromium ore in Baltimore that is being shipped over to England to be used. If you think about the bright yellow color on the English coaches that was made during that period, that's all chromium that's being imported from Baltimore. And so the Baltimore mines were tremendously productive compared to, as far as I know, any other mines in Europe or in Russia, and they really dominate the 19th century market for chromium.
And then I have a question from Ann Anderson. Have you investigated deck blue? And if you have, what makes it so special?
What's the name of the blue?
I think it's a theater deck color, deck blue she's asking about. I'm guessing not.
Okay. No, tell her to send me an email and we can talk more about it, because I haven't looked into it, and that sounds like it would be super interesting.
And then Phil English is asking, what role did lead play in Majolica glazes? And that might be the next paper or talk that you give, but maybe you can touch on it a little.
Absolutely. And the sort of pop that you really see in the Majolica colors is due to the incredibly high lead content of the glaze, the high refractive index. And so it's not just the juxtaposition of the purples and the turquoises and the pinks that the French might have found a little garish, but I find to be magnificent. But also the lead glaze is really the secret to what makes Majolica so magnificent.
The last thing I have here is from Joe Briggs. Oh, maybe there's a couple more. Sorry. Joe, thanks. Joe, thanks. Joe is our co-curator on the Majolica Mania exhibitions, thanking you for bringing Baltimore in. So excellent. At the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. And then I don't know that we'll have an answer to this. David Tolk is asking if Minton produced two types of Majolica. And I think we're referencing the sort of maybe the Palissy versus the more Majolica equivalent objects. So
it is true. There's the Palissy wares that tend to have quite a different palette than most of the pieces that I showed here. And I talked with Jody Wilkie about this quite a bit, but haven't had the opportunity to really get my hands on any to study. And so that would be interesting, another interesting comparison to make.
Maybe one last one from Carolyn Arcadelli again. Another thing that occurs to me, it must have been a great boon to have this pigment that could produce a reliable red range glaze fired in oxidation. Am I right that these were all achieved in oxidation? I wonder if the reliability of chromium glazes was something that was commented on in your research.
Oh, great comment and question, Carolyn. Yes, these are oxidation fired glazes, which is amazing because traditionally we think of like a sang de boeuf glaze as something that has to be done in reduction firing in order to get that beautiful oxblood color. And that's very technologically challenging. And it's technologically challenging literally from the Bronze Age up to when these chrome tin pigments are invented. And so the ability to do this without a reduction firing is a huge boon to using this technology for sure. And I didn't really have the opportunity to, because again, I didn't have those tiny samples to look at how the lusters were made, but that the lusters do involve a reduction firing because you have to go from the metallic salt stage down to a metallic stage. And so reduction firings were possible, but always very tricky.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of our seminar today. And I would like to again thank all of our speakers for their wonderful papers, illuminating talks, and thank all of you in the audience in the room and also online for joining us and asking all those great questions. We all do invite you all, if you're able to get to New York, to see Majolica Mania in our galleries up until January 2nd. Then if you're not able to get to New York, you can see it next year in Baltimore from late February through early August. And if you want to book your tickets for New York, or if you want to see all of our upcoming programs, which include one next week about making Majolica, making the Majolica Mania exhibition with myself and Susan and Laura, we'll be talking about that. Next Thursday, Jen has a program in October about lead glazes, sort of I guess a Halloween inspired one because of their death and glazes, I think we can call that perhaps. And we have another interesting program, I think, in October, amongst many of the programs related to the exhibition on race and Majolica and how it's reflecting some of the cultural attitudes of the 19th century. So look for all of those programs and book your tickets on our website, bgc.bar.edu, and thank you so much.